originally started by doing some peripheral research at a national park. I noticed a couple people following me around the park. I was interviewing people that were employees of the contractors in the park, not National Park Service employees. And at the end of the day, I went back to my room and get a knock on the door, and there's a person standing there, and they say, yeah, I'm a National Park Ranger. I'm off duty. I have some information for you I'd like to talk to you about. They come in, we had a conversation, and they told me that themselves and others that they had talked to had worked at several parks in the past and had worked missing person cases in those locations. And they felt that some of the locations that these people disappeared were odd. There was a lot of publicity in that 7 to 10 day cycle and a lot of news coverage. And then at the end of the initial search, boom, it was over. There was no more follow-up. They themselves had looked for information on cases, and it was difficult to find, and they couldn't figure that out and couldn't understand it. And after talking to other people in other parks, they realized that there's something really unusual going on, and they think somebody should look into it. And they knew my background, and they said, you know, you should really devote a lot of time to this because there's something here. The next morning, called a couple law enforcement guys on the way home. I told them the locations to look at and see if there was anything unusual. They called back in a couple hours and said, wow, there's something here. That's kind of how it all got started. Originally focused on national parks and then branched out into U.S. National Forest as well. The National Park Service has a large contingent of federally trained law enforcement officers. They're throughout the national park system. These aren't the rangers wearing the Yogi Bear hats. These are actually dedicated law enforcement people that carry guns, issue tickets, and make arrests. They're better trained than most law enforcement officers in medium and small cities across the U.S. because they're trained at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Facility. They have an administration just like every law enforcement group. They understand the need for keeping information on suspects and missing people. If you look at most medium-sized and large-sized police departments across the U.S. and you look at their website, there's usually a section about missing people, and in that section, many times, there's photos and information about missing people. Every state in the U.S. has a missing person website. And the need to understand where people go missing, the circumstances of their disappearance, and the need to get publicity and to get that picture out in front of the public is known throughout law enforcement. That's why they put them on bags, they put them on milk cartons. It's really an important fact of the missing person investigation. Well, I filed the Freedom of Information Act against the National Park Service probably 5 years ago now, and I had an attorney call me back from the Park Service asking me why I wanted that. That was red flag number one. I explained that that's an inappropriate question. You can't use that as a deciding factor. He says, well, we already decided anyhow. We just wanted to know why you wanted it. And I said, well, what do you mean? He goes, well, I know you claimed an author's exemption because you have a published book, but your books aren't in enough libraries to qualify for that exemption, so we disqualified you. And I said, well, can you point me to where that is? He goes, that's our policy. I said, oh, okay. I said, well, I'm interested in the number of missing people from Yosemite and from your entire system, as I had explained. And he came back and he said, well, we don't keep a list of missing people from Yosemite. You must have a list somewhere. He says, no. So I filed another Freedom of Information Act request because I thought it was maybe they were playing some semantics game with me on the request. So I wrote it again, and this time I got a written response from the local regional manager for the Freedom of Information Act for the National Park Service, Charis Wilson out of Denver. And she stated, no, they understood the first time, there are no lists of missing people. And I said, well, how can that be? And she said, we rely, and this is a quote, on the institutional memory of our employees for that information. And she said, but we understand your request, and we understand you wanted to know if it was denied, if we could just quote you a price. So the price is $34,000 for a list of missing people from Yosemite and $1.4 million if you want it for the entire system. Now, hindsight's always 20/20, and a lot of people have said this to me. They said, well, if you're relying on institutional memory, why should it cost so much? Just call the people in and ask. But, of course, I never got the information, and that started a hunt for us going through archives, talking to national park rangers, people, etc., and we came up with a pretty healthy list of missing people from national parks. And because so many of the criteria match people who disappeared in national forests as well, we started to include those. And part of that, the factors that we use to eliminate cases is a voluntary disappearance or a mental health issue with the person, we wouldn't work it. If there was some relationship to animal predation or there was some associating factor that showed that maybe the person was attacked by an animal, we excluded that. We excluded any where there was some possibility of human violence. So those were all the factors that vetted out the peripheral cases. Then we stayed in the park with cases where the people disappeared, there weren't answers, the Park Service seemed to be standing in the way of us getting answers, and probably the cornerstone case to that is a girl named Stacy Aris who disappeared in the next city over from me in Saratoga, California. She was 14 at the time, and she disappeared in Yosemite National Park. And her and her dad and 6 other people were riding on horseback into the back range, and they were staying at some cabins really in the middle of nowhere, Yosemite. They got to the cabins, Stacy got out, changed clothes, and her and a 72-year-old man were just going to walk over to the point and sit down, and she was taking pictures with a camera. Everybody saw him walk to this point, sit down, and the older man sat down. They were at about 9,500 feet. She told the man that she was going to walk down this rocky granite hillside to a lake that was maybe 300-400 yards away and take pictures. The people saw the man. He never moved. Stacy walked down the hillside. She was never seen again. A huge, huge search that lasted weeks found the lens cap to her camera inside the periphery of a wooded zone around the lake, and Stacy was never found. So that was one of the first cases I went after pretty hard, named the date, the location, the person. This time I get a call from a special agent from the National Park Service Police named you. Why you? Calls me up the same thing. Why do you want this case? I said, well, it doesn't really matter, but I just want it for some research. He says, well, you're never going to get the case. I said, well, then why would you talk to me like that? First of all, I probably have 15 other cases at this point from other national parks on missing people, so why would you stand in the way of this? He goes, no, you don't. I said, what do you mean, no, I don't? He says, you don't have other cases from other national parks? I go, yeah, I do. And he goes, well, then they must have been found. I said, no, they were never found. And I said, another question is, why isn't she in the national database for missing and exploited children? And he said, she is in there. I go, no, she's not. Yes, she is, you're lying. He called me a liar a couple times. It wasn't a good conversation. And he eventually said, you're never going to see this case, so you might as well just give up. And to this point, 5 years later, he's correct. Of all the cases I've named in national parks, I've gotten a lot if I name the specific case and date. Sometimes they claim that they're national archives and they don't have them anymore, even though the person's still missing. Other times they just say, well, we can't find them. But most of the time I get them. At this point, if you kind of follow the pattern of the national parks, okay, so I have an attorney call me, I have a special agent call me, they're standing in the way of a missing persons case. You told me when I talked to them that it's just classified as a missing person, there's no suspect, there's no criminal involvement, and the case hasn't been picked up in 14 years. It goes back to what those rangers said at the beginning, is that there's that 7 to 10 day cycle where there's information available, there's a lot of publicity, there's a lot of kind of a show of force, as you'd say, and then after that, there's no follow-up, there's nothing. That's it. In the past, I ran into, by pure accident with a friend of mine, a special agent that was retired from the National Park Service, one of the people I really wanted to get to. And we ended up having a long conversation, and I asked him, why would the Park Service be taking this position? And he went on to explain that he was actually investigating a superintendent from the parks for some major theft, and he was told by his superiors, shut it down. And he goes, Dave, I had him cold left to right, and I was told to drop it. And he says, it's a total lack of integrity. Those were his words. From top to bottom, a total lack of integrity. A husband and wife worked at a national park together as rangers, and they thought that there was something strange going on with the budget in the park. So as private citizens, they filed a Freedom of Information Act request to get a hold of the budgets that they had questions about. They wouldn't give them up. They appealed, and they lost, and the next thing you knew, they were out of a job. I had always heard unofficially from the U.S. National Forest Service that they didn't keep track of missing people. And I thought, okay, I want them on the record telling me A or nay. So I filed a formal request. Initially, one of the FOI people for them came back and said, I don't think we have anything. I talked to one of our law enforcement authorities, and they said, we don't have anything like that. So I said, okay, can I have the name of law enforcement authority? And then they came back with a formal letter signed by an individual inside their system saying, no, they have no list of missing people, period. What's interesting about that is that, like the National Park Service, they have a branch of the U.S. Forest Service that are law enforcement officers. Their job, just like all police officers, investigate, look for, and keep track of. But apparently they don't either. Well, as another good journalist I know said, if they don't have it, they're idiots. If they do have it and they're keeping it from me, that's against the law. So either way, they should all be fired. So one of the first things that's surprising to many people is that when they bring canines, bloodhounds in to track the missing person, the canine sometimes walks in circles, sometimes they lay down, sometimes they walk up the trail 5 feet, come back and look at the handler. And as somebody who worked around tracking canines for many years in law enforcement, I can tell you that those dogs live for the hunt. And they're excited, and when they do something like that, that means there is nothing there. And on the cases that we work with, about 95% of them, the dogs do exactly that. There's no scent to be found. They don't want to work. There's nothing there. There's a water relationship to a vast majority of the cases I worked in national parks and forests. There's a geographical clustering effect. And at the beginning, first 3 years, we're not even looking for this. And then afterwards, we thought, seems like there's a lot of people missing from Yosemite and a lot of people missing from Sequoia. Maybe we ought to just put a pin map up and put the locations. And we did, and we almost fell over. As time went on, there were 52 clusters of missing people in North America. And yes, there are people missing outside those cluster zones, but the vast majority fall into those clusters. And those clusters run up and down the east and west coast through the Rocky Mountains. There's essentially none right down north to south in the middle of the United States. And there's clusters all the way around the Great Lakes. And that's where I say it comes back to water. Many times, if the victim is found alive, they're either found alive unconscious or semi-conscious on the ground, not moving. And if they're found, many times they're found deceased in a variety of unusual circumstances. The vast majority of the victims, if they are found, they're missing clothing or shoes or both. Now, those are the predominant 5 that you need to think about. There was a reporter for the Huffington Post a couple years ago that wrote an article, and the title of it was "Don't Be Last in Line." And he had read my books, and he understood that there's a first in line, last in line concept with this. First in line, last in line in a group of people where people don't have you in sight. For some reason, you disappear. A lot of times you're not found. And it seems that at both ends of that intellectual spectrum, there's a large amount of disappearances. Some people that have dementia or autism or some very debilitating disease, those people tend to disappear a lot and are never found. On the opposite end of that scale, you have physicists, physicians, academic types that disappear and are never found. And this isn't something that's happened just in the last 10 years. You can go all the way back many, many decades, and this has been going on. I'll even give you a different analogy along the same lines as my son. We were talking about this one day, and he goes, "Dad, you know what this is like? This is like you go to the arcade, and you look at that claw machine, and you look at the games and the toys down below, and you kind of have an idea what you want to go after. You put the claw over it, and you drop right on it sometimes, and you get the one you want. You pick it up, and you move it away, and you're not dragging it, but you're picking it way up. You keep it for a while, and then you drop it out, and you throw it out another entry point." I thought, wow, that's pretty good. There's also been a lot of press recently about the national parks opening the parks up to, elementary school kids that are allowed to come into the park. And a lot of people said, it's almost like they're forcing the bait into the park. There's some really, really big national parks, and there aren't a lot of disappearances there. The biggest ones, Yosemite, Great Smoky Mountain National Park, Crater Lake National Park, Rocky Mountain National Park. But then again, there's some like Bryce Canyon, Grand Canyon. There's hardly any. Well, somebody sent me 2 or 3 months ago, it was a list of all the movies that have been filmed in California's national parks. It's maintained by the National Park Service. Well, okay, they know how to keep lists, but they're not keeping lists of the important things, or at least they're not making them public. Sometimes when you get into research like this, you get maybe a tunnel vision on just the national forests and parks. I've got to keep more of an open mind. I didn't really want to go into that city area because it's easy for people to say, oh, you know what, that's a human abduction, or, oh, you know what, he's just trying to force this to tie into something. Whereas in national parks and forests, you're not going to get a human abduction on a trail. And in all my years, I've never heard of one, except going back to the 60s in Carpenter, the trailside killer in California. But you don't hear of that. And so for that reason, maybe it was easier to enter that arena without getting a lot of flack because there isn't much to be had. Now, going into the city, there's probably some of this going on. I was reading a lot of different material, and I was reading about a series of young men. All of them were described as college, super smart, athletic. Some of the articles said these are the smartest and the best of the best out there, and they disappeared. And they were later found under some unusual circumstances all in the same sort of area. And right away I started thinking, okay, so all these guys are super smart, the best athletes, described as best of the best, kind of fits one end of that intellectual paradigm that I've been writing about. So I said, okay, I'm going to start looking at this. And right away, when I got into the minutia of a few of these cases, I realized, wow, canines weren't finding a scent. There's a direct water relationship. There was a clustering effect after I looked at about 50. The victims, if they were found dead under unusual circumstances at best. Some were found alive and unconscious, semi-conscious, missing clothing, missing shoes. I'm thinking, holy cow, somebody hasn't put it all together and read my research to see that, wow, there's a direct line between this and that. Kind of how it all came about. I was real cautious in this book. I wanted to look at medical evidence, and there was a lot. Victim statements, there was a lot. Parental opinions, there was a lot. And there were even some newspaper people that jumped on board and thought, what's happening here is unusual. Like I said, I spent maybe 15, 16 months doing the research on this book. Many of the disappearances in this book are in the same areas the disappearances from the first 4 books are in. Around water, a clustering effect. I mean, it's right there. So there was a professor named D. Lee Gilbertson and a retired New York City detective named Kevin Gannon. And they wrote this book called Case Studies in Drowning Forensics. That's really probably what got me into it. And they talked a lot about a few cases. And it reads just like a textbook. It's the size of a textbook, and it's pretty expensive. Great reading. These guys did a phenomenal job. One thing that I think hurt them is that they were looking, just like I was looking at parks and forests, they were looking just at these type of cases. And they didn't have the ability to look at the entire spectrum of the U.S. like I had already looked at. One of the other big mistakes is one of these people at the beginning started to make an association between some graffiti that was found around some of these sites. It wasn't found at all the sites, and they tried to make an association that certain people were doing this. But when you look at the history behind it, the number of countries involved, the timing of the deaths, it's impossible that it's one person. It's impossible that it's a gang of people. Many of the same countries are involved. That's what's unusual. Somebody in Canada decided to file a Freedom of Information Act in Canada because their Freedom of Information Act only applies to their citizens. So we could file one in Canada and they could just ignore it and it's no big deal. Well, somebody filed one in Canada with the park. They're equal to the National Park System. They came back and said, too, we don't have any lists of missing people. Even though I've written a lot about Canada, a lot about missing people up there. And again, it just mimics exactly what's happening down here. I do have a GPS transponder. I have a firearm. Sometimes I have a sat phone. I don't want somebody else to write about me disappearing. I do think that a lot of things in the wild are easier found when you're alone. And I want to practice what I preach, and I would say that 99% of the time I have somebody with me. There are a few stories, I'd say 1930s or 40s in Pennsylvania, where 2 kids, 4 to 5 years old, disappeared at the same time and were found deceased weeks later in the same location. Unexplainable. Very, very rare. Logic doesn't seem to play a big part in this because, to give you a quick case, there was a man that could barely walk. He was on crutches. He was elderly. I think he was in his early 70s. And he walked a couple hundred yards from a parking lot to sit on a boulder next to this slow-moving creek that was a couple inches deep. And the family said, okay, we're going to go take a walk. And he said, oh, take your time. I'm not going to move. I can't move. I'll be right here. They came back in 35 minutes. He was gone. A huge search. They never found him. There's actually a lot of stories like that where logic doesn't have a role in this. In the case of Miles Robinson that we talked about in Wengen, I don't think his decision-making played any role in what happened because he couldn't have gone from A to B under his own power. The man I just told you about in Yosemite, I don't believe he could go anywhere under his own power. I have had very, very few people discuss these type of cases because they don't fit within their logic profile. I've had other people from law enforcement say, well, you're ignoring some major points. People do disappear in the woods, and sometimes they're not found, and you have to stop right there and say, yes, but a canine in most instances would be able to track the people, at least partially. In most instances, you put a helicopter up with FLIR, you should be able to get some results. People normally fit within a grid pattern that's designed for search and rescue. They know, let's just say a 3-year-old isn't going to go more than 1.5 miles. They aren't going to go more than 400 feet uphill, and they're going to be found in less than 2 days. That's like a 99% profile hit. The reason they got to that is because the number of cases that they've done that fit within that grouping. Now, the unusual part of it is that there's a certain number of these cases that fit so far outside the bounds of it that nobody wants to discuss it. What I said earlier about 100% success rate, you don't get the people coming back and say, a bear dragged me away and at the last minute it let loose of me. And the closest thing we have of that is small kids making these statements about a big doggy or some other type of animal that they saw or that bothered them. I mean, we were talking about the Atadero case beforehand. Jared was a 3-year-old boy, and his parents owned a resort up the Poudre Valley in Colorado in Larimer County. October 2nd, 1999, Alan Atadero had a group of Christian singles at his resort. And they asked him if they could just go down the road a little ways, very, very short ride, and go to the fish hatchery. And he said, sure, that's an easy ride. And they invited his daughter, who was, I think, 5 or 6 at the time, maybe even a little older. At the last minute, Jared saw his sister was going and said, well, I want to go too, and begged his dad, and his dad said, oh, okay, and they said that they'd look after him. This Christian singles group goes down to the fish ponds, and at the last minute, they decide, we're going to go up the road here a little ways meaning like 20 miles, and they're going to go walk on this trail in the middle of the woods with Alan's kids without his approval. Make a long story short, Jared gets ahead of these people on the trail, way ahead of them, and these singles decide that I guess that they're not going to take control of the kid, they're just going to let him run. And he goes up the trail, and he runs into 2 fishermen that are by themselves. He walks up to them as they're on the river, and he asks them if there are any bears around here. And the fishermen say, no, there's no bears. We've never seen a bear. We've come up here for years. There's none. Don't worry about it. And he takes off walking down the trail. And I tell people this story, and they say, are these fishermen idiots? They let a 3-year-old just walk into the woods by themselves without stopping the kid and saying, hey, wait right here for your parents? Are you lost? They let him go. That was the last time anybody saw Jared alive. There was a huge search and rescue effort to find this boy. I will say that. One of the things that I've written about in past books is the crash of aircraft in conjunction with searches in these cases. And I write about 5 of them. This is one of them. Air Force brought in a helicopter, and right when it started to search for Jared, something happened and it crashed. Everyone survived, but it was taken out of commission. And the area of the search was stopped momentarily while they had to do the search and rescue for this. So as Alan Atadero, the dad, is at search and rescue headquarters a couple days into the search effort, they bring in some new canines. One of the search people says, hey, we need the scent bag. And they reach under this cabinet, and they have this giant bag that they pull out. And Alan goes, wow, it's a big bag. What do you got in there? And now, for 3 days, this search has been going on using the scent of the scent bag. And this is a 3-year-old boy. Alan looks inside, and they got a pair of his trousers in the bag. Needless to say, Alan was a little upset, as we all would be, and that was just like one of many, many major mistakes that were made. Because Jared was 3 years old, this got a lot of press in Colorado, and a lot of people stepped up, and a lot of big-time professional searchers volunteered their time, and some came down to the search location, met with Alan, and said, hey, we're here to help. They were thwarted by Larimer County. Alan couldn't quite understand why they kept pushing these people away. Nothing was found of Jared. And, I mean, it was a comprehensive, big-time search for weeks. So fast forward 4 years later, there's some people that are hiking high above the Poudre River in the valley. When Jared was last seen, he was right next to the river talking to these fishermen. You or I could cross this river. It's not that deep. But there was a lot of thought going into it. And, in fact, Alan was told, your son's going to be found in 4 years in the river. Why would you say that? I already told you he would never go near the river. And they said, no, he's going to be found 4 years from now in the river. Well, he is found 4 years later, but it's not in the river. It's over 500 feet straight up the side of this mountain. My son is a Division I hockey player in fantastic shape. For me being an old man, I'm in pretty good shape. It took us every ounce of effort to get into the location where Jared was found. Some hiker just happened to be hiking on the rim of this mountain next to the trail and came across some remains and some clothing. Now, this is 4 Colorado winters later, and I can tell you for a fact that the shoes that were found at that location look like they just came out of the store. His pants were found turned inside out. They found one tooth of Jared's sitting on top of a log, and then they found his cranium, not his lower, just his upper, sitting next to a tree upside down. That's all they found of Jared, a cranium and one tooth. There was a lot of talk about this. Alan was a very smart man. They found a sweatshirt that Jared was wearing, and it was almost intact. He showed the sweatshirt to some mountain lion trackers and experts and said, what does this look like to you? And they go, well, your son wasn't attacked by a mountain lion because they would have eaten right through that shirt and they would have gone straight into his torso. The pants being turned inside out didn't make any sense. The shoes being on top of that mountain made no sense. And the reason being is that Jared never, ever tied his shoes, and they were always on his feet loose. When I was doing the research on this and I saw the photos of where these shoes were found, I thought the same thing. If any animal's going to drag them up that hill, those shoes were going to fall off in the first 10 feet. And in talking to Alan, his dad, Alan said, there's no way he was dragged up that mountain because those shoes wouldn't have stayed on. I've been a MUFON investigator for 12 years, so I try to keep a broad spectrum on all these things. There was a boy who disappeared in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. He's a Boy Scout, and he was last in line. And they were marching out, and he disappeared. Huge search. 8 days after he disappears, they're along a larger creek, small river. And out in the middle of this, in the middle of winter, there's a foot of snow on the ground. It's flowing. There's a large boulder. And on the boulder is the boy's backpack and all of his clothing neatly folded on the boulder. They're seeing this, and it's a bizarre scene because nobody's going to walk into the middle of that river and fold clothes in the middle of winter. So they go further up the river, and later on that day, they find the boy at the base of a tree with his pants pulled down to his ankles. What was important about that story to me, yeah, the clothes were important, but that was also the second case of a young man being found in a national park in the middle of absolutely nowhere with his pants pulled down to his knees. But when you read the facts behind the event, there's no way it was anything along those lines. It was something completely abstract, not normal. The other case involved was at Crater Lake National Park. Again, not in any reports. You would never even know about this if I hadn't tracked down the ranger who met with some witnesses that found this scene in the middle of the wilderness. And he and his partner rode in, and they found at the end of a small box canyon, again in a creek, he stepped over a large down Douglas fir tree, and on the other side, he sees a pair of jeans, Levi's, that have been unbuckled, unzipped, and dropped down to a pair of socks. Again, this person had no boots on either, and the boots were never found. And this guy's name was Marion, and Marion said that, Dave, he goes, I looked at this, and he goes, there's no flesh. Whatever happened here happened many years before, but the buckle was undone, the zipper was down, his underwear, the elastic of the underwear was still down on the ground. There was one broken tibia bone in the right leg. All other bones were gone. He found the top of the cranium about 15 feet away and no boots. And he goes, there were no boots anywhere, Dave. And he goes, in 35 years of doing this, I've never not found boots with a body. And he said that he and his partner were so uncomfortable with what they saw there that they backed out, went back to their headquarters, called the FBI in Portland, and said, you guys need to send an evidence response team into our park and work this scene and explain what happened. The disturbing part to this for me is that we have a group like the National Park Service who understands that these things are occurring, and they're not informing us to be more careful, to stay in pairs, maybe even mandate that you hike in pairs. They're not trying to protect us. I think what they're referring to on the Washington case is actually an Alaska case of 4 people, a family that disappeared there about a year ago. About 2 miles from their house, they found some people found some bones and some clothing, and I think they're looking into it. It hasn't been confirmed it's them yet, but I know that the FBI actually got that case, and they were dumbfounded about what happened to the family. So I don't know about that. And the Yosemite case, I looked at that this afternoon, and the implication from the Park Service is that guy probably fell into the Merced River because he was last seen on a footbridge above the river. And I think that's what the implication was there. At that beginning point, you got family people staring you in the face. You have relatives coming into town. There's a lot of pressure there to do something and to get the publicity out. So I think it's hard to turn it down at that point. When people go home, I think it's easier not to take the call, if you know what I mean. First one is a woman that disappeared on Victoria Island in Strathcona National Park in Canada. Sylvia Apps, 69 years old. She went missing July 11th, 2014 in the Comox Valley. Super experienced, super good health. Left for a hike from Paradise Meadows on July 8th. She signed into a logbook and she summited Castle Craig. And she failed to arrive at a pickup point on July 13th, and that's what started the search. They found hikers that saw her just south of Castle Craig Mountain on the 11th. Now, what's interesting about this case is what they found, not what they didn't find. Searchers went in there, and in one location along a ridge line, they found her cell phone. Another location, they found her walking poles. Another location, they found her camera, and then they found her backpack. To quote the search and rescue people, they don't know why they were in the positions they were in, but they thought that they were going to find her imminently because of the scattered property. The SAR commander, search and rescue commander, a guy named Paul Berry, this is what he said. He said, it has provided a roller coaster for both the family and the SAR teams. Clues you think are pointing in the right direction don't pan out to give you anything. And I have heard that statement many times before from other search and rescue commanders. And he says that we feel like we're getting close and then come up with nothing. It's very mystifying. And he said that the lady is tough as nails, and if anyone could survive, she could. 150 searchers, canine teams, helicopters with forward-looking infrared radar. They searched until July 21st, then they gave it up. The search commander stated this is the first time in his career where they found all of the person's supplies and they didn't find the victim. This area of Vancouver Island is beautiful, big mountains. High up on these mountains, there's no trees. It's above tree line. Weather conditions at the time were very warm, and they were concerned that she might have problems with the heat, and because it was unusually warm. Keep the profile in mind. She's a 69-year-old lady, July 11th, 2014, in Canada at a national park. Back up 12 days, June 18th, 2014, a woman named Karen Sykes. This is a really unusual case. She's a marathon runner. She's 70 years old. She was described by the Seattle Times as the guru of the trails. Nobody knew more about Mount Rainier National Park and its trail system than her. She hiked 2 times per week. She had written articles for local newspapers and magazines. She'd written a book about safety on the trails. This is the woman who knew everything about it. She was hiking with a friend. The friend got a little tired when on the trail they reached snow. He said, I'm going to stop. She said she was just going to go a little further up the trail and she'd be right back. She was never seen by this guy again. They were hiking an area called Ojai Lakes Trail, and it's in the northeast corner of Rainier. The partner hiked back down the trail and eventually got a hold of rangers at 10:30 that night, and a 3-day search started. Now, it was stated that she was carrying gear to spend the night overnight in an emergency if she has to. Now, don't think that's strange, because anybody out there should be carrying some kind of emergency blanket or something to crawl into just in case you have to spend the night out somewhere. So she was doing everything right. Now, they started an intensive 3-day search. On the third day, a helicopter found her in an area that was highly unusual. She had to climb up over the top of a 6,200-foot ridge, walk halfway down an adjacent valley in a gully of Boundary Creek. She had to have walked through snow, and she could have turned around and followed her path back if she had been paying attention, and of course she would have been. But in the area she was in, she was found in this gully where there was no snow. In essence, she went uphill and then went downhill. She died of hypothermia, and her friend stated she was the last person in the world that would have ever gotten lost on Rainier. The Park Service even made a statement. This is their quote: "She was found in an area that was difficult to access and not commonly traveled." They couldn't track her. They didn't track her. They found her by helicopter, just on a general grid search of the area. So we have a 69-year-old disappears on July 11th. We have a 70-year-old that disappeared 12 days later on June 18th. Now, in my book, wrote about a woman 66 years old, Geraldine Largay, disappeared on the Appalachian Trail in Maine. Her and her husband George married 32 years from Brentwood, Tennessee. Great relationship. She always wanted to hike the Appalachian Trail. Super experienced hiker, in super good shape. So her husband George was going to be her support system. And they would meet at designated points along the trail, and they'd spend the night sometimes. He'd restock her with food, just exactly what a great support system should be doing. Well, her goal was to get to Mount Cattenden in Baxter Park. Total trip would have been 1,150 miles, and she'd completed 950 miles. On July 22nd, 2013, she sent George a text saying she was 8 miles from her next stop and would be arriving on time on July 23rd. The 22nd, it rained heavily on the trail where Geraldine was located and where she would have texted from. George shows up on the 23rd. She doesn't show up. Her husband calls Maine's Warden Service. There's a TV show about Maine Warden Service law enforcement, and they actually did an entire show on this case a few months ago. And it was excellent because it showed how comprehensive the search was, how frustrated they were, and they found nothing. They didn't find her backpack, nothing. A 3-week search, and they went the distance on this one. And they described it as mystifying. The cell phone that she had either broke or was out of batteries because they pinged it and they didn't get anything. All of these women were older in age. All were in outstanding physical condition. 2 of the 3 have never been found. The third one is somebody that would have been the last person in the world to disappear. She knew the trail system like you know the road to and from your nearest market. The idea that she disappeared and wasn't found is illogical. If you were going to pick somebody to make an example that, hey, no one's immune, that would have been her. These actually were women on a slightly different scale. But all of these cases mimic each other in a strange way. And the first case involves a physician. Telika Patrick, 30 years old. She was working at the Borges Medical Center in Western Michigan University. She was a first-year psychiatric department resident. Went to a hotel trying to get a room to get some sleep. She couldn't. The hotel was full. She had her driver take her back to the medical center to get her car. She gets her car and she starts driving down I-94 near Lake Michigan. She doesn't show up at her residence, and she doesn't show up the next day at work. They report her missing. Her car is found in a ditch with a flat tire on I-94 in Porter, Indiana, 1 mile the way the crow flies from Lake Michigan, and Burns Harbor is less than a half mile away. Many, 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 many of these cases involve water of some type. And I mean a river, a creek is nearby, a lake, a pond, the ocean. Now in this case, Lake Michigan is less than a mile away, and there's also a large pond on the other side of the fence next to the freeway where her car was. It's called Lake Charles. This is strange. Why the FBI got involved in this case is the million-dollar question. But they did. They say they don't get involved in missing persons cases unless it's a very young person or unless there's some kind of criminality that goes along with it. But they got involved, and they and Indiana law enforcement searched this pond for 3 days. They found nothing. Her wallet, her credit cards, and her cash were all found in her car undisturbed. She went missing on December 5th, 2013. Her body is found in that same pond 5 months later on April 6th by a fisherman. And the family demanded to know why the canines only tracked her from her car to the shoulder of the freeway and stopped, and why her body wasn't found in the pond when it was searched. There's so many parts of this that fit what I've talked about already tonight. Canines can't find the body. The scent doesn't go anywhere. The body's found in a location that had been searched thoroughly by multiple agencies. And the family's asking the same questions that you and I would ask. They didn't release the autopsy on this, and that was troubling to me, because an autopsy like this is going to show the state of decomposition of the body, ocular changes to the person, was there skin slippage, how long was that body in the water, did she still have hair on her head after being in water 4 months? All these kind of things are unanswered because they won't let us see the autopsy report. And then the really good question to me is, what was the interest of the FBI in this when it was classified from the very beginning as just a missing person? Leticia Marie Fa, 50-year-old woman, lived in Patrick County, Virginia, a graduate of the University of North Carolina. She was a pharmaceutical sales rep, very, very smart lady, considered by all people to be well-read. She had a real close relationship with her mom. Her mom was elderly. On December 9th, 2009, she was in her 1994 Honda Accord in Floyd County, Virginia, going to the pharmacy to pick up some supplies for her mom. After she did the shopping, she called her mom, told her she was coming home to drop the stuff off for her. She didn't return that night, and her mom called the sheriff. Huge search. Completely out of character for Leticia to do this. Her car was eventually found on the Blue Ridge Parkway on a street called Walnut Ridge Drive in Franklin County, described as a very, very remote area. Well, I know that if I'm in law enforcement, I find that car, I'm going to be thinking she was carjacked, murdered, and dumped. They played it the right way, except that they found her wallet, all the food, her purse, her money in the car, all not disturbed. And, hold on to your hats here, the searchers found her sandals she was wearing halfway between her car and a half-acre pond that was on the property where her car was found. So the sheriff gets out 4 robotic cameras, and 3 separate dive teams search that pond, and they find nothing. This area, there's a street, this Walnut Grove, kind of extends out into the valley, almost like an overlook. When she disappeared, it was freezing rain and snow, and that hampered the search efforts for that following week. And they stated blatantly that they had no idea what happened to her. One of the unusual things was, and think about this thoroughly, freezing rain, kind of snowing when she disappears, yet her window is rolled down on the driver's side. And I said, now what would cause you to roll down your window if you were alone? If you're a female, you may not roll it down all the way if somebody walked up to the car. But if you saw something and you were trying to hear something, maybe you would roll down the window if that felt safe.
Dave, let's jump into some cases, starting with one at Yosemite National Park. Tell me about this guy. He's 20 years old.
Yeah, and he fits the profile of 2 other cases I've written about out of Yosemite, where the profile of this person is they're young, college, brilliant, described as others as brilliant, a huge future, pre-med student, this one. His name was Dikran Kanajian. Disappeared July 24, 72. You will not find anything out there about this, hardly at all. And I dug deep to get this because I knew the parks would not supply anything. And during a Freedom of Information Act request on communications about Dikran, there was a flyer, like a cable that came through from Ethiopia to our State Department, and that's how I originally got onto this. Anyhow, he was a student, a pre-med student at Cambridge University. He was born in Ethiopia, and he was born into a family that were watchmakers, and they were in the diamond industry. Well, he was vacationing in the U.S., planning on going to Florida, but first he was going to stop in Yosemite, and he checked into Curry Village, and it's this little tent camp that's in the base of Yosemite, and he was staying in cabin 486. And he checked in, and he was within a mass of people. These tents are right next to each other. It's like a little homeowners community. And you rent a tent for a few nights. Well, he went there, dropped his luggage in his tent, and he went back to the front desk, this area that kind of manages all these tents, and he asked them for directions to Half Dome. And that's one of the largest pieces of granite in the world. And the person said, oh, yeah, all you have to do is walk through this paved path, and it'll take you right there. So he was last seen heading in that direction. Well, on July 31st, he was supposed to check out, and the maids went in, and they found his luggage sitting on the floor, just like someone had left it, and the bed never slept in. So they called the National Park Service police, and they started doing an investigation. And they found out that somebody at that front desk had given him direction days earlier where to go, but they didn't find anything. They didn't even know really where to search other than the path between where his tent was and Half Dome. But they put some posters up. And really, that's all they ever did. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Park Service may not give any reports out anymore from Yosemite, because maybe they are embarrassed. I don't know. It's just conjecture, but a lot of people think this. Now, Dickeron's dad, his name was Vartkus, and he was the owner of a company called Bacchus and Strauss, still around. It's the oldest diamond company in the world, and it's known for making these super high-end watches. Well, his father went to the U.S. Embassy in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia and asked for assistance in finding his son. And the U.S. said, okay, well, let us send some cables, and that's how I found it. And they sent some messages to some jails around the area and some hospitals. They didn't find him, that he was in any of these locations. Well, the father felt that he wasn't getting the ultimate cooperation, so he contacted President Nixon via the Emperor Haile Selassie in Ethiopia and asked them on a friend-to-friend basis to help him. This is getting pretty high profile. And then he also went out and contacted Governor Reagan and asked him if he could help. And Reagan said, well, this is federal jurisdiction, but I'll see what I can do. And in the end, they weren't getting anywhere. He hired a private investigator and tried to find something, and they found nothing. Well, make a long story short, I had some contacts in the diamond industry, and I asked them if they knew Vartkus, and they did, but he had died. But his son was also named Vartkus, and his son, that's still alive and running their business, would have been 2 years younger than Dickeron. And I was put in contact with Vartkus, and we had this email exchange back and forth. He said, David, nobody cares. And he said, just the other day, I put a request in through the National Park Service for a file so I could kind of see what had been done with my brother's disappearance. And I was denied. And he said, I appealed it, and nobody would even respond to the appeal. And he says, now, I live in London, and he says, I feel like somebody in the United States, such as yourself, should have more power to get something out of your government than me. But seeing as my family's a victim, they won't even help me. He's completely lost. And I can't tell you how many times I've spoken with families that have the exact same feeling. In the beginning, that first 7 to 10 days, there's a lot of effort, there's a lot of show, there's a lot of press, there's a lot of searchers. But at the end of that 7 to 10-day cycle, that's it. There's nothing more. There's no other searches. There's no other work done. That's the end of the story. And unless somebody stumbles across a body or bones, nothing else is going to be done. And the reason I picked this case to talk about is I've also written about 2 other college students that disappeared, were never found, that were staying in the park in the same sort of area that Dickeron was, and they were never found. And in those instances, the parents happened to hear about each other accidentally from a reporter, and they made a request on President Eisenhower at the time to send in mountain troops to help search the valley floor because they weren't getting any assistance. Now, this is the only place in the world where I know of where 3 college students described as brilliant disappeared in a congested area of the park, supposedly, never went off a paved trail, and were never found. One of the things that came out in the last couple years is medical professionals that disappeared, and that could be paramedics, nurses, physical therapists, and it seems like they are disappearing at a higher percentage than the normal population. In conjunction with, German physicists, there were several cases of people high up in religious organizations that disappeared under these same profile points. And in this instance, Dr. John Marshall, a lot of people ask me, well, are there ever people from the armed forces that have disappeared? And this is probably about as close as you can. He was a 49-year-old retired lieutenant colonel from the U.S. Marines, and he was head of general surgery at the Spokane VA. This case mimics cases I wrote about in Missing 411, A Sobering Coincidence. In that book, I focused in on the same profile points, but where people were found in water. And this is a unique subset in that when men disappear and are later found in water deceased, 99.9% of all men will be found face down in the water, and women will be found face up. There are a very, very small number of men whose bodies are found face up. Why? They can't figure it out. A large percentage of those, they couldn't figure out the cause of death on the people that were found in the water. On the face, it looks like it's drowning, but it wasn't drowning in the end. Now, in this case, John was a super good guy. Every morning, he would get up at 5 a.m., drive his car to downtown Spokane, to the YMCA, and then leave his things in a locker and go take a run in the city every morning. He was religious about it. He was in great shape. On the morning of July 25th, 2015, he left his wife, who was also a physician, and their 2 kids in a rural house. He drove down to the YMCA, got there at about 5:30. At 5:33 a.m., they have him on camera walking out the door to take a run, and he's in his running attire. It's the last time he was ever seen alive. Well, when he didn't return to the YMCA and he didn't make it to the VA for his scheduled operations, his wife was called by the other physicians saying, "Hey, where's John?" His wife went down to the YMCA, and they said, "Well, we saw him leave, and here's his locker." Well, in the locker were his keys, his wallet, and everything, and his car's still outside. She calls the police. That morning in Spokane, there was a heavy, heavy fog all over the city. It was wet, and it was raining, freezing rain, and it kept the Spokane helicopter out of the air to search. So they had just ground teams looking all over the city for John, and they looked everywhere. And there's a big river that flows right through the middle of Spokane, and they thought, well, maybe somehow, we don't know how, he might have fallen in the river because there was no place else to look. And they searched the river and walked it all the way up and down through the city, never found anything. Now, he disappears on January 25th. On January 26th at 8:58 a.m., downriver, they find, somebody calls in and says there's a body face up in this river. They go down and they find it. It's John Marshall. And he's found just below these rapids that are about 15 feet high that come down, and there's a predominant place where it settles, and this is where he was found. Now, they pull his body out of the water, and in his left front pocket is an iPod. And unbelievably, the iPod is completely dry. And the detectives couldn't find a point where his body could have entered the water, meaning he slipped down an embankment, fell over a railing, any witnesses, nothing. Well, they knew he had to go over the rapids, so as they pull him out, they in the coroner start looking for vegetation that should be on the body because it tumbled down these falls. There was none. Now, the police are getting suspicious because they're not finding the things that should be relevant in this obvious drowning case, and they tell his wife, Well, you're not sure what happened, but apparently he drowned. So it goes to the coroner, where the wife right away knows something's wrong because John's a great swimmer. He's a super athlete. He did, multiple tours in Afghanistan. He was a battlefield physician. He was like the optimum guy you'd want working on you and being your buddy. So the PI starts to look into this, and it starts to make press. And the PI said publicly he didn't believe John ever went into that water or went down those falls. The PI publicly said John had to have been placed in the water somewhere. Well, the coroner stated that the body was in the river for 27 hours, meaning that almost immediately when he walked out the door from the YMCA, he had to have gone in the river. Now, a detective in New York coined a statement that I'll use every time, and it's called local reports for local consumption. And that means that some people will say anything just to put this case out of sight and out of mind. Now, if the body was in a large flowing river for 27 hours, there's no way in hell that iPod could have been dry. The coroner's verdict was accidental drowning. The PI believes Marshall was murdered. Now, I wrote an entire book about cases identical to Dr. John Marshall's, and I called the PI on this. And he was a retired sheriff's deputy, really smart guy. He goes, Dave, there's no way this guy fell in the river, and there's no way he rolled down that river all the way through the city. And why his body is face up, I'll never know. And I said, okay, John, and I explained to him, these dozens and dozens of cases that have occurred just like this that nobody can explain. And he says, wow. And he was blown away. And to the point was, it took a while, but I got all the cases from Spokane and all of the photos. Everything supports what the PI said. And I got to give it to Spokane police, and specifically the detective on this case. He told the wife, he said, I don't know what happened here, and I'm not even going to pretend that I do understand, because this is one of the most confusing cases I've ever seen in my life, and I don't think he jumped into the river, and it doesn't appear we can find an area where he fell into the river. So how he got in, how he died, why he died, I don't know. A lot of times, many times, on these cases where it appears it's an accidental death, cops don't get really intrigued by that. And it's real easy to just rubber stamp it. And years ago, when really these cases first started to show up, there was a detective in New York that was working missing persons. And he started to realize that bodies were showing up in the rivers around New York in places where, supposedly the guy was missing in one part of the city, and he shows up in a river in the other part of the city, but that would have been completely upstream from where he disappeared, so it didn't make any sense. And then the biggest thing that this guy discovered, and I discovered in all the cases I investigated, is that the time that the person was missing, say he disappears on a Friday and he's found on a Tuesday, that body doesn't show 4 days in water. It shows just a small amount of time in water, which means where was the person for those 3 or 4 days? In my thoughts, and in the thoughts of the coroners that do second autopsies on these cases, they were alive for the vast majority of that time, and then they died within a short period of time from where they were found.
Was there a second autopsy?
Well, the second autopsies are super expensive. They can be like $2,000 to $3,000. And I don't know why John's wife didn't ask for a second autopsy, because she was highly suspicious of the whole entire process. But one thing is that in the second autopsies, they found GHB in a lot of these bodies, and that's a date rape drug. Now, there's no implication about how these people got the GHB in the super high levels in their bodies that were found. And in the instances where the coroners ruled that they did drown, if you think about it, a date rape drug is where it makes you almost comatose, where you realize what's happening, but you can't move. So imagine if you had high levels of GHB, you were placed in the water, you might drown. You would drown because your body can't fight back. One of the things I identified in past books was the disappearance of physicists. And a specific German physicist disappeared in California hiking on a rural trail while he was on a retreat visiting from Germany. He was at a conference. Well, while I was digging around, I came up with a guy who was 61 years old, disappeared April 1st, 2007 in Coconino County in Arizona. His name was Reinhard Kirchner, and a brilliant German physicist. And he had a residence about 1,000 feet from the Rhine River, worked for a company called GSI, and they operated an accelerator that dealt in heavy ions. He was single. He liked to travel, and he was headed to British Columbia, where he flew into, picked up a camper truck and rented it, and planned to meet his girlfriend in your town in Las Vegas a couple weeks into his trip. Well, he left Germany, picked up the camper truck in British Columbia, and then drove it down into the States. And they backtracked, and they found that at one point he was registered at the Staircase Escalante National Monument for 2 nights. He then spoke to his girlfriend in Germany, told her he was in Page, Arizona, and they planned to meet when she flew into Vegas on April 9th. Well, Reinhardt never met her. She went to a hotel, waited, and then called the sheriff in Page, Arizona, reporting him as missing. Well, on April 12th, the sheriff's got a call from the Navajo police stating that they had an abandoned camper truck near the edge of the Little Colorado River Gorge on State Route 64. Well, the sheriff arrived, found the doors to this camper truck locked, and they ran the plate, and it comes back associated with a missing person, Reinhardt. Well, they called the owners in Vancouver, and they said, yeah, he had it rented for this period of time. It was reported missing, blah, blah, blah. So the sheriff calls in some search and rescue people, and they start searching the area. Well, the girlfriend told the sheriff that Reinhardt had been to that specific area before where they found the truck, but she didn't know why he went there. And it was determined that the only thing he took with him that day was a camera and a day pack, nothing else. Well, because this is near a national park, the Navajo police, and the sheriff searched the area with helicopters, planes, ground teams, dogs. They found no scent, found no trail, they found nothing. Well, it turns out that the gorge is really close to where it was parked. It's just across the highway from the truck. And in the gorge, there were 3 different teams from U.S. Fish and Wildlife that were doing fish studies in that river. So they went and interviewed them, and they said, no, we never saw anybody come down the cliffs, down into the gorge, nothing. But about the time the search was starting to get going, there were wind gusts up to 50 miles an hour that restricted the use of their helicopter. And the camper that they found that was Reinhardt's was treated like a crime scene, and I got those pictures. And there was food in the refrigerator. It looked just like a camper truck that I would use if I was going to travel cross country. There was nothing unusual about it per se. But they found his notebook with the last entry in it of March 31st. And they figured that the truck had been at that location since April 1st. Now, one of the reports written that I got was written by a guy named Lieutenant Mark Christian. And he wrote in his report about an interview he had with a local resident that drove up to the truck on April 1st because it was an odd place to park, and this local just wanted to make sure everything was okay. Well, this local had taken photos of the truck and given them to the sheriff. And the sheriff happened to ask the witness what he thought might have happened here because it's so strange they've never had a truck parked out here in the middle of nowhere. And the witness stated, and he noted in his report, that the locals had talked that Reinhardt had been taken by aliens. There was also a note in the report that at about the time Reinhardt went missing, a silver object was seen in the sky by the truck by the locals. So, in this case, what's so bizarre to me is that they bring dogs into an area that doesn't have a lot of population, a lot of scent of other things, of other people, and they can't pick up any tracks, and they can't pick up any scent. They talk to the people in the bottom of the gorge that just happen to be there, and they don't see anybody coming down into the gorge. Where's Reinhardt? I have an open mind about this stuff, but imagine that this is the second German physicist that disappeared in the middle of nowhere. What are the odds?
There's another case, Charles Olich.
You talk about one of the most mundane guys in the world, 63 years old, January 29th, 1975, Ulrichsville, Ohio. It's about 50 miles south of Akron. And he lives essentially right next to a big river. And he was employed by the state of Ohio Employment Services in New Philadelphia. His wife worked for the hospital in New Philadelphia. And they lived in this rural house, and there were no neighbors close by. Described as extremely healthy and extremely religious. He was a Sunday school teacher and a church elder. And his wife, Dorothy, and he lived on the outskirts of the city along County Road 39. He was a father of 2 kids, and one of his sons was a professor at Purdue, so they had good genetics. Friends said Charles was one of the most stable and honest people you could ever meet, and he was extremely into his routine. And his wife told investigators that every morning he wakes up at 6 a.m. He makes coffee for both of them. He shaves, he dresses, and then he wakes his wife right at 6:55 each day. And they go into a room and they both watch a religious show for 5 minutes and then another show until 7:30. Charles then would take a path from their yard kind of through this woody area to Highway 36 and catch a ride with a fellow Mason member. Well, on January 29th, 1975, was like no other morning. And Dorothy's alarm goes off at 7 a.m. Well, she never heard Charles get out of bed. And he didn't wake her that morning. And it was weird that she hadn't heard him get up, and she hadn't even thought or felt him not wake her because she was so much into a routine. She said, for some reason, she slept through all of this. And she searched the house, and she found the front door open a couple inches, but no Charles. And he hadn't made the coffee, and she determined that when he left the home, he left without his keys, his wallet, his belt, and his shoes. In a lot of the cases I write about, the victims are found with no shoes. And shoes I've talked about this a lot. The one thing that we wear every day that we really never clean, but also what carries the most bacteria on our body are the shoes. And that's been the one consistent thing in talking to a lot of people, the shoe issue. And Dorothy called a neighbor to help her search, and then they couldn't find him, and they called the sheriff at 8:45. Now, the morning that Charles vanished, there were heavy thunderstorms right over their house. And she told authorities that Charles had a cough, and he had the flu the morning he disappeared, but he was better. He was getting better, and he said he was going to go to work. There were several massive searches. They found nothing. Now, the morning he disappeared, deputies reported several screams at a nearby strip mine gravel pit. They searched it. They found nothing, but they thought it was weird that the same morning he disappears, within a mile and a half, they have these calls at this pit. And I wrote about several cases in Sobering Coincidence that these gravel pits were found bodies. Now, this is the strangest thing. I've never heard of this. Second major incident, shortly after Charles vanishes, Dorothy, his wife, buys a German Shepherd for protection. Well, one day she returns home from the hospital, and she finds the dog tangled in electrical cords, and it has a broken neck. And she called the police about it because she thought it was so odd that this dog could break its own neck getting all tangled in these electrical cords. But Charles was declared legally dead in 1980. There's a couple things about this case that to me are bizarre. No shoes on when he leaves the house. That's odd. How did Dorothy sleep through Charles leaving and sleep through those thunderstorms? Odd. Why would he walk out of the house with his pants but no wallet, money, belt, or keys, or shoes? And he was listed in perfect health 2 weeks before the disappearance. He had just seen his doctor, no dementia, no Alzheimer's. And then it's an amazing coincidence that this dog has its neck broken in the weeks following. I don't even know if a dog could break its neck that way.
What are we to make of these, Dave?
It almost appears as though people travel distance to get someplace to die. Years ago, I remember watching a movie where a series of people all left this city and went to a specific location, and they all met each other, and they couldn't figure out why they were in this specific location. And in some of these cases, the people do things so far out of character that it doesn't make any logical sense at all. And like you said, it's almost as though they're in some kind of zombie state that they've got to get somewhere. They probably don't know why, and they do things that don't make any sense that we'd normally never do.
You've got updated all the charts of the cases and broken it down into some categories, and it kind of jumps out at me. You break it down by victim age and by sex pretty clearly. 2-year-old, 3-year-old through 10-year-old. The biggest cluster of all are kids. That whatever is doing this focuses on kids first in those age group 2 to 10, and then there's another spike in the early 20s, 20 to 23.
So when I first came up with this, I went to a geneticist and I said, "What could you tell me about the difference between somebody's DNA at 2 years old versus somebody's DNA at 40 years old?" And they said, when you're early in life, your genes and your DNA are so pure that they haven't been altered in any way, and they haven't had illness, injury. They haven't been altered to the point that they would be at 40. So when you're 2 years old, you've got some optimum genetics. But as you get older, alterations start to happen to your DNA. Not that the DNA changes, but you have things that you wouldn't have at an earlier age. Say cancers develop, things develop where you wouldn't have it at that pure state. And that's the only thing I could ever grasp myself, why those younger groups stand out versus the older groups.
We're talking about this U.S. Navy blimp that's patrolling off the coast of California, and the blimp comes back, crashes on land. The crew is gone. Dave, pick up the story from there.
So the Navy did their investigation, and they said that there was no fire on board. When it hit the beach, originally when it hit land, it dropped one of its bombs accidentally. That made the blimp lighter. It was able to take off again and crash in that Daly City neighborhood. There was a massive search off the coast that went on for days, and they never found anything. They reviewed radio logs. There was no call for help. They could never explain why the blimp went straight up into the clouds after dropping the flares, and they thought that it would have stayed lower to watch the slick that they were watching on the water. There was lots of watercraft in that area. They never found the crew or the emergency survival equipment that they were wearing. And this is an area outside the Golden Gate that I've written about many times before, because just north of San Francisco, you have Point Reyes National Park, which has had several strange disappearances I've documented. And just south of the Golden Gate to a location called Half Moon Bay in that area of the coast, I've written about other disappearances that are very, very strange. No other part of the Northern California coast north of that Point Reyes area, and nothing immediately south of Half Moon Bay. So it's this one area that has this strangeness attached to it. They came up with some explanations that, to me, that were laughable. Or even if they'd come out of their life jackets, they would have recovered the jackets.
Right.
Because the area, the water that was searched out there was searched so thoroughly. And eventually, those jackets are going to wash up to shore, and they would have recovered them on the beach. So these explanations absolutely made no sense at all.
You have another case from Scotland.
Sure. December 24th, 1975, 9:30, occurred on the island of Mull. It's an island in Scotland. He's 55 years old. Gibbs was a war hero. He was an intellect, and he was a pilot. He flew Spitfires in the Battle of Britain in 1940. He was staying at a place called the Glen Forsa Hotel, and it sat right on the ocean, northeast side of the island of Mull, and there was a grass airstrip there. And the rooms were right next to the airfield looking at the water. He arrived at the hotel on December 20th. On December 23rd, he contacted the owner of a Cessna 150 parked at the airstrip and asked if he could fly it. Ian Hamilton was the attorney, negotiated a price to fly the two-seater. And on Christmas Eve, 1975, at 9:30, Gibbs walked out to the plane with a hotel guest named Felicity Granger. And she thought she was going to go with him on a flight, but he told her no. She had to lay out the torches so he could fly and land. So she exits the plane, places the torches out in the field, and she sees him taking off in the plane, flying out over the water. Now, some reports say that after he took off, they saw strange lights on the water. Some people said it might have been a fishing boat, but they could never identify the boat, and they could never see where the lights went. Well, make a long story short, Gibbs didn't return on the plane. And there was a major search on and off the island for days, and they found nothing. And they found sheep herders and ranchers that searched all their property. They got nothing. Well, on April 21st, 1976, this is about 4 months after the disappearance, Gibbs's body is found on a knoll, and this isn't a mountain, it's like a knoll near the airfield. And he has a small scratch on his chin, nothing else. And a shepherd took part in the original search, and he walked by the spot where the body was found multiple times and never saw it. Now, if Gibbs had jumped from the airplane, there should have been more injuries and broken bones, and they never found the plane. Nothing physically was wrong with him, so he could have walked back to the hotel, the best everyone could tell. The coroner stated the cause of death was exposure, meaning hypothermia, and he guessed that he probably died 2 hours after takeoff. Well, they examined his clothing, and there was no salt or marine organisms on the body. That means he didn't go into the ocean and crawl out. Unanswered questions what were the lights on the water? Really, how did he get there? Really, how long had he been dead? Where was the plane? And in my notes on this, I write down GHB again, because there's no reason for a man to die of exposure on the top of a mountain. When people get cold, they get up and they walk. You don't lay down and die. Obviously, the top of a mountain is colder than the bottom, or where you could see humanity from the top of this mountain. Strange case. I look for cases that are insurmountable, meaning that explanation doesn't fit. I have several cases where somebody leaves a house, and within 100 yards of the house, they find a pile of clothes. And the person left the house, and it was 70 degrees. Well, yeah, later that night, it got down to 50. But the person left the house, and in 100 yards, all their clothes is gone, and they're in a stack in this field. This has happened multiple times. Also, I've had other cases where a parent says, my baby couldn't take off their clothes. So if somebody's saying they removed their clothes and they died of hypothermia, good luck with that, because the kid couldn't take off their clothes. So the cases I try to include, I try to explain this rationally. Well, I've written of cases where special notes were made that the clothing and the body was impeccably clean, like it just came out of a laundromat and the body just came out of a shower. And they couldn't explain why everything was so clean. Well, the same thing applies to the water-related cases. When a body's in water, it does certain things that we know, certain things to the hair, loss of hair, wrinkling of body, fingernails, things like that. And when these bodies are pulled out, coroners have made statements that, well, the person disappeared on Monday, but they've only been in the water for 24 hours, but they've been gone for 6 days. So where have they been for all this time? And that's the importance behind finding a body, especially in water, because it shows things that it wouldn't show otherwise. One of the questions I get all the time is, are these people ever found to be abused, sexually abused, things missing from the body? That's not the case. If they are found, they're found pretty much intact without a lot of injury to them. I mean, one of the things that people have said a lot is that, well, Dave, what they're doing is they're taking the soul. When we first started this trip together years ago, people said, oh, he knows what it is. It's
right.
It's got to be something mundane. It's maybe some crypto topic that he just doesn't want to talk about. Well, we've come a long ways. And I think if you start shutting the door too early, you can't see really what may be obvious years later. And that's one of the reasons I've been reluctant to say anything that, may be a possibility, because it may close that door for me. I mean, thinking where we are today versus where I was 6 years ago, it's
right.
a huge distance. I wrote about a case in Michigan several years ago, and they tracked this guy's phone all over this area. And according to the pings and according to where it hit, he would have had to have crossed a road multiple times in this pattern that he was supposedly tracked in. And there was never any evidence he was in any of these areas, and he was found deceased in an area probably where he should have been and where they were originally looking. The pings didn't make any sense. This happens probably more often than you hear. And everyone kind of just sloughs it off and says, well, maybe it's just the technology, we don't know, maybe it's not that good. There's some reason we're getting these pings in these areas. And it's disconcerting that they happen because it not only throws off the search, there's never an adequate explanation as to how it got there.
You have some cases where kids are taken, they're very young, and their explanations are pretty weird, so no one takes them seriously about, I was taken away by the big talking bear or something along those lines, right?
Yeah, those are hard to explain. And, a lot of people, a reporter will put in the article, that's just a kid's imagination, the searcher said. Well, is it or is it not? Well, yeah, I wrote a story in my last book of a Spanish priest in Texas that was running from Native Americans and came upon this giant piece of pink granite in Texas. It's a state park. And he said that as he ran up to the top of the granite, it opened up and swallowed him. And he said that he was inside this boulder, he guesstimated, for 3 days. And then he said at the end of the third day, it spit him out. And that isn't the only story I've got like that. And people probably don't know this, but there's stories out of Iceland that they will move a road when they're building it before they will blow up a piece of granite or a big boulder, because they have a belief in their society that things are living inside of those boulders.
David, we're talking about the little case of Jared, who was out there, stumbled across a couple of fishermen. He was playing around with the water, and the fishermen didn't like that. What happened to him?
So search went on for weeks, and in the middle of the second week, his dad, Alan, got a call, and this person said he was from the inside of the sheriff's office, and he said, you're not getting told the whole truth. They're withholding information from you, and I hope someday you'll learn the truth. And the guy hung up.
Wow.
Well, 4 years later, and about 700 feet above this trail, some people were hiking, and they found some clothing that they thought was Jared's. So they call search and rescue back in, and the sheriff's office goes in there, and they find a skull cap, and they find one tooth sitting on top of a log. And the clothing, his pants were inside out. The jacket he was wearing was laying on the ground, and he was wearing two shoes, and both those shoes were sitting on a boulder in the same vicinity. Now, George, what's interesting about this is that the shoes looked brand new.
4 years later.
Yeah, in 4 Colorado winters at about 9,500 feet, the vibrancy of the colors in the shoe were very high. So they took the clothing and they sent it to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and they didn't find one drop of blood on any of the clothing. And originally, the sheriff came out and gave a press release when they found the clothing and said, he got attacked by a mountain lion and died. And the press threw it all over. And I've gotten a lot of heat from people who never read the book or the facts saying, why are you publicizing this? Because it was just a mountain lion killing. There's no way it was a mountain lion killing, because 4 experts that we have all looked at the evidence and said there's no way a mountain lion killed that boy. And Alan explained one of the key parts to this is that when Jared walked around, he never, ever tied his shoes. He didn't know how to, and he never wanted them tied. And if Jared was carried up the mountain and drug up that mountain, there's no way his shoes were going to make it up there. Now, myself and my son went up to that mountain, went to the point where he was found, and I can tell you it's about a 70-75% incline through some of the roughest, rugged, boulder-laden cliffs you can imagine. And to think that anything was able to drag Jared there, I don't believe it.
Is it preposterous, David, to come up with a scenario that maybe these people are being beamed aboard like Travis Walton was in his case?
You know, I've had that told to me probably hundreds of times. And Travis and I are friends on Facebook, and I respect him a lot. And there's some of these scenarios that explanation would fit part of it. But then again, it doesn't fit all of it. And that is probably the perplexing part of these disappearances, is that it's hard to find one scenario that maybe fits all of it. I wrote a couple of books, and I started to see physicist missing. And then all of a sudden I said, you know what? I'm going to start looking to see if they include occupations or academics on these things. And in one of the first books I wrote, there were two men missing from Yosemite 3 months apart. And these really, really caught my attention. There was a young man named Orver von Loss, and he was a graduate student at University of California, Berkeley. And another man named Walter Gordon, graduate student, UC Berkeley. Both disappeared the same year, 3 months apart, in the same area on the valley area of Yosemite. They were both walking in areas that would baffle you why or how they disappeared. Each said they were going for a short walk. Neither guy knew each other. They were in different majors. One was an economist and one was, I don't remember, but both were described by their friends inside of Cal as brilliant, absolutely phenomenally smart. Now, neither one of these were ever found. And I talk about these clustering effects of missing people, not just in geographical context, but also in time and space. And the weird part about Von Loss and Gordon is that there wasn't a lot written about them in 1954. And I don't know if that was purposeful or not, but their families pushed so hard. They wrote to the president at the time, and they asked the president to send in special forces because they knew that their sons were taken. And they said, there's no way our sons would have walked away on their own. So we need help. And their request was denied. I made a request through the Eisenhower Library, and I actually got a letter that they wrote, and it's touching. They really wanted help, and they were ignored.
And nothing. Why? Why are they ignored?
Why wouldn't they give this up?
You would think so.
According to the law, they're supposed to. And there's cases I've asked about out of Yosemite under the Freedom of Information Act, and I've been told by the special agent in the Park Service that I will never get that case. And I asked them if it was a criminal case. They said no. They said it's just a missing person case. I said, has anybody touched the case in 12 years? No. Are there any suspects? No. I said, well, but I've gotten 30 other cases from other parks across the U.S. that are missing persons cases. Well, yeah, you might have gotten those, but you're never getting this. I said, well, what's the reason? Yep, no need to know. You're not getting it. That's their attitude sometimes. Now, I should preface this by saying that the frontline park ranger that you meet in the park and that person wearing the Smokey the Bear hat, those are the salt of the earth kind of people. They are really, really dedicated. And we've met a lot of them, and they were all some of the best people we've ever met in our lives. And I would hold zero animosity towards them. And when you talk to them, they feel that, I can't say all of them, but the ones I've interviewed all have the same feeling about the administration. They're stymied in their efforts to find information sometimes. There's a couple of National Park Service rangers that have a website that they thought there was improprieties going on regarding their budget inside of a park. They filed the Freedom of Information Act against their own service to get budget information, and they were eventually eliminated from the Park Service because of their inquiry. This information restrictions that are being placed by the Park Service are coming from people at the highest levels of the administration. These aren't rank-and-file people making bad decisions. These are the upper administration people saying, you're never going to get this. Namely, I wanted a list of missing people inside the National Park Service. They have a group, and I've been told There's 600 people approximately that are law enforcement officers within the Park Service. Now, that's a pretty large contingent of federally trained law enforcement personnel that carry guns.
Sure is.
Some are special agent status that are detectives. You cannot convince me or any other journalist that this group of people is not going to track missing people in their system. I love the national parks. I go all the time. But there's a couple things I don't do anymore. I don't ever go alone. I don't ever go on a hike in a national park without a personal locator transponder. I don't ever go without carrying my gun. And if I am going, I'm always going to let somebody know where I'm going
That's
in,
smart.
when I'm coming out. And if I don't, you come and get me.
Have there ever been reports of more than one person being taken at the same time?
Very rare, but there have been times. It almost seems as though the victims in these cases are people that are taken by opportunity. You know, first in line, not in sight, last in line, not in sight, alone, separated from others. A lot of times it's a hunter that gets separated from his hunting partners, and you'll say, I don't even know if they're on radio together. I don't know where I'm at, and I don't know if I'm going to find my way out tonight, so I'm just going to stay here, and then they never see him again. So it's almost like an opportunity issue, and when we talk about the intellects that have disappeared, it's always they're alone for some reason when they disappear.
Do you think that they're being stalked or tracked before they disappear?
You know, and we've had talks about this as a team, that it would almost appear that when the opportunity presented itself, even if it's just minutes, sometimes seconds, then the person is gone and they're not found. I think I'd be foolish to say that, no, that's not the case, because there are times where I do think that is the case.
Geographically, David, is there a specific area that gets more of these disappearing cases?
Well, let me talk about an area that doesn't get any disappearances, and that's right down north to south, right in the middle of the United States. And another location that almost has nothing but is surrounded by clusters is Nevada. There's one or two inside of Nevada, but on the whole, when you look at the map, there's this dearth of nothing. Now, when I was a policeman, we would put up pin maps tracking serial robbers or serial rapists.
Right.
And one of the things they don't do is they never do something real close to home. They'll do it away from home. Usually the first time is closest to their house, but it's not very close. But then they'll spread out in a pattern, almost a circular pattern from where they live to do their crime. And I've had other law enforcement guys say, Dave, it looks like the middle of Nevada is where whatever's doing this is living, because obviously there's nothing there. I mean, it's very strange, but all the way up the West Coast, there's an entire series of disappearances, and people have reminded me that it kind of follows a path of volcanic activity all the way up through British Columbia. And then coming down through Montana, Idaho, and the Rocky Mountains, going all the way down into southern Arizona, there's clusters. Again, one of the things that's predominant in these cases is relative location to water or mountains, namely completely surrounding the Great Lakes, all along the Appalachian Trail within hundreds of miles of the Atlantic Ocean, and then right on the Pacific Ocean.
What are the possibilities that there's a sick organization out there that is doing this almost as if it's an initiation? Go ahead and get somebody.
Well, again, you have to remember that a lot of these people, small kids, have disappeared on rural trails in parks and forests. And I know for a fact that some of the best tracking bloodhounds and canines have brought into those areas, and they've utterly failed. As somebody who's worked with dogs for almost my entire career, I know that those dogs live for that job. And for me to believe that time after time those dogs are failing, I don't believe it. And so I don't think that it's possible that a human could be taking somebody down a trail from the point they were last seen and the dogs wouldn't pick up on it. Or trackers, some of the best Indian trackers in the world have gone into these areas and have failed. And I know that if there had been somebody walking out, they would have tracked them. it's happening with more and more frequency. In the last 3 years, there's been an escalation in these type of disappearances.
David, this case of a hunter found in the mountains in Montana.
Aaron Hedges, 38, he went missing elk hunting September 7th, 2014. They searched for him long and hard, and he was one of those guys that got separated from his partners. And it was in an area of Park County, just kind of northeast of Bozeman. And they didn't find him. Well, 6 months later, they find his boots and some other items that it wasn't real clear, but they didn't find him. There was a massive search of the area. Then another 3 or 4 months later, they find his orange vest, his backpack, and some other items in another area. And anyone who has been hunting knows that you're not going to be taking your boots off, and you're not going to be removing your backpack because it's kind of your lifeline to your food and your protection. So the whole thing is very strange, and I think it's concerning to the people there because they found these strange items in areas that doesn't make any sense. But, once you read these stories, you'll understand that this isn't uncommon. And I'm talking about in sometimes warm environments, you're going to find that people have completely stripped themselves of clothes, and it's an impossibility that it's in a hypothermia situation because they haven't been out in the environment long enough to develop the hypothermia. And I get reminded of that a lot, except when you're talking about environments where it's warm or the person couldn't have been gone long enough to develop the situation that is alleged.
Are there some similarities here that you can tie together?
More often than not, they're going to be missing clothing or their shoes or both. If they come back alive and they can speak, almost more times than not, they don't have a memory. And if they do have a memory, they tell strange stories. Sometimes they'll say that people have been following them in the woods. I know that sounds weird, but that's what they'll say. And, push them for a description, and they really can't give any. Sometimes if they're found deceased, they're found very close to a river, creek that's dry, and it would almost appear that it would be impossible for them to get from the location where they disappeared to the location where they were found. And they are found sometimes without shoes, without boots. Classic case, a physician named James McGrogan. He's from Indiana. He disappeared just outside of Vail, Colorado. He was with a group of friends, and they were backpacking up, and they were going to stay in an area high above Vail, and they had split skis with them and backpacks. Dr. McGrogan got ahead of the group. He disappeared. He was missing for almost 2 or 3 months. He's found 6 air miles east of where he was last seen in an area that would have been essentially impossible to get to. He's found with the skis on his back. He's found in a dry creek bed, dead from a head wound. Apparently he fell, and he had a helmet on. But the strange thing that wasn't in any newspaper reports, wasn't in any police reports, it only appeared in the coroner's report, is that when they found him, he didn't have his boots on. We interviewed the people at the sports shop where he rented everything. He had enough supplies that if he was lost, to put his tent up that was in his backpack and camp for 2 weeks and survive anything. He had an avalanche warning device. He had everything.
Why is it happening to these people?
Well, if you go back to the intellect side of the fence where we talked about earlier, scholars and intellects have vanished. I put McGrogan in that highly, highly smart man, young man, ran marathons, brilliant emergency room physician. He fits with that very, very smart person that wouldn't make those mistakes that he made. And I actually feel really, really bad for his family because I don't think they're aware of anything we're talking about here because it doesn't get mainstream coverage. What can we do?
Do you think some of the people in the park systems know what's happening?
So the higher-ups, the top-level administrators are not idiots. I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but you can read the data that I've laid out, and you can see that there is something highly, highly unusual and coincidental in case after case, 1,600 of them, that all seem to follow the same patterns. And people on a big trail disappear and they're never found, that to me seems impossible.
What about this case of this Arizona woman?
The title of it was Las Cruces Woman Abducted on Arizona Camping Trip. Again, if you look at all of the cases I have, that word abduction and kidnapping will come up when they come up with nothing at the scene.
Exactly.
And there's no shoes, there's no sweaters, there's no backpack. They eventually have to say they were kidnapped or they were abducted because there's nothing else left. Now, this woman falls into this category that I've been talking to you about, extreme disability. Partially blind, suffers from short-term memory loss. They were 4 miles southeast of the Chiricahua National Monument. But why that's important to me is, first of all, there's a cluster of missing people in this area. That monument is the only National Park Service location in the U.S. that I can figure out where an on-duty National Park Service ranger disappeared and was never found. His name was Paul Fugate. And now this woman disappears 4 miles from there. She was with her mom. Mom was going to use the restroom. She said she was just going to walk back to her car. It's in a pretty big camp area, a lot of people around. Nobody hears anything. Nobody sees anything. Canines can't track anything. They don't find her shoes. Again, this happened in a place called Rustler Park. This woman just vanished.
David, what was that case we were talking about yesterday where a little boy disappeared?
June of '69, Dennis was 6 years old. He was with his dad, his grandpa, his brother, and they were in an area called Spence Field. They hiked into it for Father's Day weekend. They were in this field playing, and a family walks up to the Martins, and this is all a series of coincidences, and I'm telling you, it's strange. So the Martin family's there playing around. Another family walks up and says, "Hey, can our boys play together?" Mr. Martin says, "Sure." And they introduce themselves. "Oh, my name's so-and-so Martin." Mr. Martin looks at him and goes, "Our last name is Martin." Now, from this point on, I've been reminded many times that, well, maybe the abduction scenario was for one of their family members, not Dennis. Now, Dennis had a slight learning disability. He was 6 years old. They're playing hide and seek. Dennis goes and hides behind a tree. Mr. Martin was a super smart guy. He was an architect. He watched his son walk behind the tree. He told me he never took his eyes off the tree. When everybody said 30, 40 seconds later, "Okay, everybody come out," Dennis never came out. Mr. Martin got up out of his chair, walked right over to the tree. His son was gone. Right adjacent to that tree, within feet, was the Appalachian Trail. He told me he took off on a dead run down the trail for 2 miles. He came back, found nothing, told his dad, go back and go down the hill and get rangers. His dad took off. Within hours after Dennis disappeared, it started to rain, and it rained solidly for 7 days. I forgot how much the guesstimate was, like 6 to 8 inches, an enormous amount.
Jeez.
Now, as this is going on, immediately as it's happening, there's a family 2 miles away, downhill in the valley, that are asking a ranger where they can go to see a bear. Rangers sent them up this area called Rowan's Creek. Now, this family's last name is Key, K-E-Y, the Key family. Another coincidence, because this is the key to the whole case in my mind. The Key family walks up this valley. They slowly get separated from each other, and a father and 2 sons are far up the valley looking up a hill, and the 12-year-old boy tells his dad, "Hey, look, there's a bear up there running around." His dad says, "No, son, that's not a bear. That looks like a man, but they're hiding behind trees." And just before they make the observation, they hear the loudest, sickening scream they described that they'd ever heard. So they see this thing running behind trees. Now, they don't know a boy disappeared. They don't know anything's happened. They come back. They eventually go home. And next day in the front page of the Knoxville Times is this story about Dennis Martin and that he disappeared, and he disappeared up on Spence Field. Well, Mr. Key says, I don't know if it's related, but I should call. So they were told that an FBI agent was monitoring the cases at the park. So they call the FBI, and they volunteer to go down and show the agent where this happened. They get a call back, and the agent and an officer from the Park Service says, "No, don't come to the park. We'll come to you." Doesn't make any sense, because if I'm the investigator, I want to know where you were at exactly and what you saw. So the Key family never goes to the park. The Martin family had an agreement with the Park Service that anything of any evidentiary value, Mr. Martin would be told. He never left the park for 6 weeks. Now, weeks later, Mr. Martin gets told about this from a newspaper reporter. Mr. Martin goes livid, but the Park Service tells him, don't worry about it because the timeline doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. And it's impossible for your son to get from point to point in that region. Dwight McCarter is the head tracker for the Park Service at the time, and we went out and interviewed him. And McCarter told us that he knew when he heard that was a lie. And he took Mr. Martin by the hand and said, hey, let's go right now. We're going to walk this and see if we can do it. And they did it in the time frame that it was alleged. And they went to that exact location. Mr. Martin was even more upset at this point. Now, who told everyone that this was impossible was the FBI agent. Now, George, I got a file that's 3 inches thick on this case from the Park Service. Nowhere in any of the documents does it talk about the Key family, their observations, what they saw, nothing, nowhere. Now, how I found out about it was that the Knoxville Times wrote a series of articles, and they wrote about this. But they left a few key things out. Now, I went and I spoke with Mr. Martin, and he has never moved from the location where he lived when Dennis disappeared. And myself and another researcher went up, knocked on the front door, came to the front door. I explained who I was, and I said, Mr. Martin, I doubt there's anybody in the world that knows more about this case than you and me. I just want to ask you a few quick questions. And he says, Dave, I spent my whole life trying to put this behind me, and I promised my wife I wouldn't talk to anybody. And at the time I came from California, he said, I traveled all the way from California just to talk to you. Just give me 15 minutes. He said, sure. And he stepped out onto the front porch. George, I've talked to a lot of victims and the victims' parents in my life. You've seen it all. You've seen it. That one conversation changed me because I was shook. We both had tears in our eyes when we left because this man was totally lied to consistently by everybody in the investigation. I started to talk to him, and I asked him a series of questions, explain to me what happened when Dennis disappeared. He did. I asked him about the Key family observation, and he said, well, Dave, you do know a lot about this, huh? And I said, yeah. And he goes, well, do you know something about that observation that wasn't in the paper and wasn't in any reports, but they saw something that wasn't included? Do you know what that was? I said, no. He said, well, they saw something that looked to be Harry running around on the side of that hill. And something was on that thing's shoulder at the time. I said, so you mean you're implying it was carrying something? He said, yeah. He said, the Key family told us that and told the investigators and told the reporter, but nobody would put that in the newspaper. Nobody would put it in a report. I said, is there something else I ought to know that happened that nobody else knows about? He says, yeah. He says, apparently you wrote about all the stories of the disappearances in this area over the previous 30 years. I said, yeah, I have. And he says, it's the same FBI agent each time. I said, yeah, I've named him in every report. He says, do you know what happened to that agent? I said, I have no idea. We've tried looking for him. He goes, he committed suicide. My God. Well, I went back to McCarter, the tracker. I told him everything Mr. Martin told me. I said, is that true? McCarter said, it's all true. I said, then what did they see on the mountain? And McCarter told me that there's a series of quote-unquote wild men, people like you and me that live off the grid, that have furs on their shoulders, and that live up there.
Bigfoot?
He says wild men, and his quote was people like you and me that just live off the grid. He goes, it's my opinion that Dennis was abducted. And I said, then why weren't they able to find him or track him? He says, well, that's a good question. And I said, well, there was even a Green Beret regiment that was brought in and searched alone. They wouldn't talk to anybody. They searched without search and rescue personnel and without Park Service assistance, and they had their own communication system. I said, even they couldn't find this thing. He says, yeah, you're right.
This unbelievable case in Idaho pops up with this missing 2-year-old little boy.
A 2-year-old boy named Dior Kuntz on a Friday, July 10th, 2015, about 2 p.m., he's in Lemhi County, Idaho, near a city called Leodore. And they're at a reservoir, and they got Grandma and Grandpa there, and they got Mom and Dad, and they got their little boy. And Mom and Dad are going to go take a walk, and Grandma and Grandpa are watching the little boy. And I'll quote the Grandma, we turned our back, and seconds later, he vanished. And that was her words. He just vanished. I always say this when I'm talking to a group. Kids always will walk away. That's just the way they are. But they're not going to get a long ways away. And you're going to yell for the kid. They're going to respond back. The best parent, there's going to be a time where accidentally you take your eyes off your child for a few seconds. And in this incident, that's just what happened, and he disappeared. Now, near the campsite, there was a small creek, not a big one. And then where the creek came out of was a reservoir, and this reservoir is surrounded by big, steep mountains. And the sheriff went in with a team and divers, and they walked the creek shoulder to shoulder. They dove the creek. He said with 100% accuracy, the boy is not in the creek.
And he also said he has never seen anything like this ever in his career. That's
right. And so the search is still ongoing to this day, and they have no leads. The canines haven't picked up a scent. Like you said, the sheriff is just dumbfounded about where this boy might be, and the parents and the grandparents have started to talk that maybe the child was abducted or kidnapped. And as I state in my books, this is a common way to go when all of a sudden you're faced with reality that the child is not there right now. Where are they? Now, in a high percentage of these exact cases, the child is found in one or two places. They are going to be found in the water, or they're going to be found high up in altitude in an area that I can guarantee where they're not going right now.
And they're going to be found dead.
That's right. And unfortunately, that is the reality of the profile that we've established. And I can tell you that there isn't a search and rescue crew, 95 or 99% of them, that have ever heard of what I'm telling you right now, because they work off a profile that, say, 90%, 95% of the time, a boy of this size is going to walk downhill, take the path of least resistance. But there was a case, and there's several, but I'll talk of just one. Now, this incident with Dior happened July 10th. Incident I'm going to tell you about happened July 13th, but in 1957 in the Eastern Sierra, and it's in a little area called Mono Village. And it's outside of Bridgeport. It's on the eastern side of the Sierra, just east of Hoover Wilderness, just outside the borders of Yosemite National Park.
Okay.
A family goes there camping. There's two lakes in a small valley with super steep sides to the valley, and it's a box valley where there's one way in and one way out, just like Dior's incident. What happened was his husband and wife step out of the camper. They see their son. He's about 100 yards from the camper. They're looking at him. They go back in the camper for seconds. They come back out. He's not there. And they search. They call the sheriff. Within days, they're convinced, and they say this, that their boy is kidnapped. They said there's no way he could have gotten out of this valley. The sheriff put up roadblocks on all the highways. They were searching cars. They were convinced this kid got kidnapped. Well, on July 16th, they bring in the Marines from a high-altitude training center that they have in the Sierras, and they explain to them where the search has been at, where the boy is not at, and now they have to exhaust every other opportunity. And I actually commend the sheriff's department in this area, Mono County, for doing what they did, because nobody would even think to do it because it's so ridiculous. So the Marines start searching, and right near where the boy disappeared, there's a switchback trail going right up the side of this super steep granite-laden mountain with no foliage on it. It's just a switchback going up 1,500, 1,800 feet. And the Marines start going up it. And they get to the top, and they go down the other side, and they said, well, there's nothing here, but we're going to keep going up the other side. They go up 3,000 feet, and a sergeant named O'Brien steps around behind a large boulder, and he sees David Scott, 2 years old, 3,000 feet above the valley, naked, except for one sock face down on the floor dead. Now, the sergeant was asked by a group of press people if there were any visible injuries to his body, and he stated at the time that he wasn't an expert and he can't make an opinion like that. But every survival person I know of that's read that story has said there is no way a 2-year-old is going to make it up the side of that mountain.
It's impossible.
And the other part about that story is that as you're going up the switchback of these trails, everybody from the valley could see you as you're going up, and you could turn around and see below. So the idea that no one saw this boy or even was somebody else going up the side of that mountain seems pretty ludicrous. And they never found his clothing. In the articles that I researched for that, there was never any indication of abuse. There was never any indication that the sheriff pointed fingers at the parents. The parents were grief-stricken. There was a lot of support. And in subsequent articles after that, the unusual thing was I never could find a report on an autopsy or coroner's statement about what the cause of death was or how the boy died.
In some cases, somebody who is in line with other people as they walk through the forests or the parks, the last person seems to be the one who gets it all the time.
And, that's something that it took us a while to figure out. And there's an individual named Roger Marsh who works for MUFON who wrote an article about that specific fact that I wrote about in one of my books. And you would think, if you're kind of that knee-jerk person, that just happens, blah, blah, blah. But it happens more frequently than you realize. And a young man, 20 years old, was in Chilliwack, British Columbia. And he was hiking with a group of friends up to a reservoir. And they were all together. And what is common in these is that the group will say, we somehow got separated. They don't say that somebody went somewhere, or they would say that this friend of theirs, his last name was Sagu, was a little bit ahead of him, but then they said all of a sudden he was gone, and we don't quite understand how it happened, but he wasn't there. They immediately called search and rescue. Chilliwack Search and Rescue responded, RCMP responded, and there was a big search. And 3 days later, they brought a helicopter in, and as the helicopter's flying into the area, not even flying on a specific path to look for him yet, they're in another part of the park, and they're in an area that has a boulder field. And if you look online, Chilliwack, British Columbia, missing man found, you're going to see a picture of a boulder field that isn't very steep, but it's a big boulder field. And in the middle of the boulder field, they find this guy dead. And many, many times, these victims are found in the middle or around boulders. And I'll read you a quote of what the search and rescue people said. They said, it's just difficult to get lost in this area. It's such a well-marked, well-worn trail with lots of hikers on it, so it's very strange that nobody had seen this individual. Then on where the body was found, it was very, very strange and difficult to explain why he ended up where he did, said Fraser, adding that the boulder field is quite a bit above elevation of the lake and a fair distance from the trail. And when you look at the interview with this search and rescue guy, he is absolutely perplexed. And I should say that in all of these cases, there's nobody that's going to come out and say, oh yeah, this is pretty normal stuff. But when you read the stories and how consistent the same storyline is time after time after time, you start to see this word coincidence so many times that almost anyone who's a survival expert says there's too many coincidences here. Well, one of the things that I get from people who haven't read the book is that, just like you said earlier, maybe there's a serial killer on the trails, and it's happened before, and maybe it's happening now. But after you get into the minutia, the data, you realize that we've mapped 52 clusters of missing people in North America, all matching the same profile point that you'll learn about. And of those clusters, the biggest cluster in the world is Yosemite National Park. Part of people's thinking is that, well, maybe it's an animal attack. And that's a natural place where we'd all go. Every case in the books has been vetted for that, meaning that search and rescue people have eliminated that possibility. Trackers that come in, they would see drag marks, they would see blood, they would see hair. People in the area that were hiking with you would hear screams and yells. There's never anything like that. There's no scene, there's no blood, there's no hair, there's nothing like that. So that's been eliminated. If you were going to take an adult person in the middle of nowhere and drag them away or carry them, that's a very, very hard thing to do. And you're not going to carry them very far. And when canines come in, they're going to still be able to track your scent, and trackers are going to be able to see you walking out of that scene. So a serial killer in the woods in 52 places in the U.S. at the frequency that this is happening, that really doesn't hold any water. Animal attacks doesn't hold any water. So those are the two primary things I hear about on a regular basis. Third thing is voluntary disappearance. If the person has a mental illness, we won't work that case. If there's any indication of a voluntary disappearance, we'll step away. So suicide, just trying to drop out of society, which people can if they want to, no, it won't fit into what we're doing.
Right.
So those are the big primary ones that search and rescue look at all the time. Now, on the weirdness factor, I mean, I've heard everything in the world, and most of the stuff I don't know much about, and people have written me thesis-length emails explaining why they are passionate about why they think the way they do, and I never discount anything. I always will read it. I'll say that's interesting, but if there's something on its face that doesn't make sense, I'll throw that in. One of the things that somebody brought up just the other day was, there's stories about these giant birds that sometimes come into an area. I mean, really giant, like prehistoric birds.
Thunderbirds.
Yeah. And there's a possibility maybe they would pick up a small child and carry him away. And the issue I have with only that one is that if the child is found, I think there would be evidence of talon grab or...
They would have pecked him to death.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And none of that has ever come across anything I've seen. As I tell everybody in front of every conference I've ever been at, we are the most open-minded people you'll meet. And I'm probably a mile wide and an inch deep. I don't know a lot about many big things, but I know a lot about a little. Just because listeners and experts in different fields have read the books and they've sent me their thoughts. Some of them are, I don't know, and others are, well, maybe, and I've never put a stamp on anything yet, and the reason for that is that I believe as a researcher you have one opportunity to get it right, and if I make a gigantic claim and later it turns out I'm 100% wrong, well, my credibility's kind of lost. And I have to look in the face of victims' families, and if they see that I'm behind some story that just is bizarre and makes no sense to them, it's hard to meet them, look at them, and hold integrity and credibility.
Tell us the case of Kenny Vach.
Well, I'll tell you what, that case is one of the most unusual because there's actually a YouTube of Kenny going to a cave, looking in it, and trying to determine what he saw and what happened to him. And this is in an area where there aren't a lot of disappearances that I've written about. This is in an area in the Sheep Mountains in Nevada. But from where he disappeared, if you look out the valley, there is a story that I did in CBS Las Vegas on their news channel about a boy who disappeared within eyeshot of where Kenny Vach disappeared. Kenny was 47 years old, disappeared November 10th, 2014, and he liked to put up YouTube videos. And they were good, and I thought they were really interesting because he'd take you into a desert landscape and talk about it, and I actually learned a lot. And one of these times he went into this area and he came out, and what he said was, when I went into this cave, it made my whole body vibrate. And he said, it's the strangest cave I've ever experienced. And he got out of there. He was alone, scared and bad. And again, if you go online, search his name, Vach, Kenny, you'll find the video. And he explained that this cave is kind of shaped like a big M's and Mary. And he left, and he thought about it for a few weeks, and he came back, and he was carrying a gun, and he said, I'm going to try to find this cave. Well, during that effort to find the cave, he disappeared. And near one cave's entrance, they found his cell phone outside the cave. Now, to a lot of people, that might not mean a lot. To me, it does, because the victims that disappear, 99% of the time, never disappear with their cell phone, a GPS device, or a firearm. Now, they found this phone in an area where they weren't sure if that was the cave he was talking about or not. They did send a remote viewer camera down into the cave, and they said he wasn't inside. But the idea about that it made him shake, vibrate, and it gave him an uncomfortable feeling so much so that he left is intriguing to me. And when you listen to him, you could hear that the guy was scared. And there was a big search. They searched every cave in that area. It was weird. I can think of a couple times in my life where I have been seriously afraid for my life. And I actually started to shake. Could have been nerves, could have been something else. I don't know. I say this too, and I think it's important to be said, is that I am not pointing a finger at search and rescue and law enforcement and saying they did an inferior job and they missed that person. Because I don't think that that person was there when they were looking. Especially the times where they say that they were walking that trail every day and they never found him. The 10th day they walked the trail out in this one case, and a tree is laying down across the trail, and this little boy is laying deceased on top of the tree. First of all, the coincidence of a tree blocking the trail, almost like telling the searchers, hey, you're not going to get past this point because you're not going to miss this.
Right. And here he is.
And here he is. Earlier this year, I was going to Rhode Island to watch my son play a playoff hockey game, and a medical examiner that I'd been communicating with from the East Coast from a very, very large jurisdiction had contacted me earlier in the year, said that she had read the books, and said, we got to talk, we got to meet. So we met in Rhode Island. And she said, Dave, you are into something here that medical examiners that do a lot of cases know what's going on. They know this is occurring, they don't know why it's occurring, and they can't explain it. And part of these cases, George, that I profiled in the book, a large percentage of those incidents, the coroners can't determine the cause of death. I mean, normally in society, especially when I was a policeman, I've never heard of that. Now, in my conversations with this coroner, they stated that in the old days, there was a lot of political pressure to clear a case and offer an explanation to the community so that there would be acceptance. And as time is going on, they stated that there still is that pressure, whether it's subliminal or overt in certain places, but how strong that medical examiner is to stand up and say, hey, I'm not an idiot, but I can't figure it out, and say that straight up. Or do they say, the person died of hypothermia, which is one of those kind of murky things that there are some things with the stomach and marks that they can find, but sometimes they really can't. And so a lot of times on those older cases, I'll read, well, the person or the child died of hypothermia. I read that all the time in old cases. Nowadays, I'm reading more and more where they can't determine the cause of death, even of the adults.
Of the amount of people that disappear, what % are found dead?
So these are the ones that fit this profile that we've established. And we're not talking about everybody who disappears in the woods. There's just these unique disappearances. We've documented about 1,500 right now, 1,600. I would say that probably 60 to 75% are deceased. And those...
They find the body.
I should say deceased, or you don't find them. But that's not to say they're ever going to be found, because, I mean, there's cases that you and I talk about where people are found 4 or 5 years later. And the strangeness factor doesn't leave. The finding of the remains even offers more ambiguity to the entire situation. But in those cases where somebody is found, there isn't always answers either, because the high percentage of those that are found, this is another factor and a profile point, is that these are people that have severe disability, dementia, autism, a speaking impediment where they can't communicate, etc. And those people come back, and high percentage of time, they come back alive, but they can't tell you what happened.
So you do have a percentage of people who come back alive. What is generally the time frame that they have been missing?
That's a big variable. And they've had some young boys, say 7 to 10, come back after 8 or 9 days, and searchers are just completely dumbfounded that the person could have lived that amount of time in the area they were at. Many of the times they're in an area where there's a lot of mosquitoes, and and the physician will make a comment like, wow, no mosquito bites, and the person doesn't have a sunburn, but they don't have a lot of clothing on. They've lost almost all their clothing. There's a couple of, there's more than that. There's probably 10 cases out of Canada that are exactly that profile, where somebody was smart enough to write it down in the report that this doesn't make sense.
In a lot of cases, the clothes seems to be taken.
The clothes or the shoes or both, and the majority of the time they're never found. Sometimes the weirdness factor goes up. They're found folded on a rock or a boulder. Sometimes the shoes, I would say a large percentage of the time, the shoes are never found. Other times the shoes are found in areas that don't make any sense. There's a case, you just briefly touched on it before the break, involving Jared Atadero in northern Colorado. He disappeared in October of '99, a 3-year-old boy. His family owned a resort up the Poudre River about 50 miles west of Fort Collins. Beautiful area. And the family was hosting a singles network of people that came in for the weekend. And Jared has a sister named Jocelyn that's a couple years older than him, and this group was going to go down the road not too far and visit a fish hatchery. And so they asked Alan, the dad, if they could take the kids up to the fish hatchery, and the kids wanted to go, and they thought it'd be fun. And so finally the dad said, okay, have fun, see you in a little bit. Well, somehow or another, something very strange happened, and this single group decided, after going to the fish hatchery, that they were going to go 20 miles further west into the wilderness and start hiking with these kids on a trail without even telling the parents. And this is part of the story in Colorado that is not being told to the public. And so they're walking the trail, and Jared, at 3 years old, gets ahead of the group that's watching him, out of sight. And he goes down the trail, and he walks up to 2 fishermen that are standing on the creek bank. And Jared's banging a stick in the water, and he asks the fisherman if there's any bear in the area. And the fisherman said, no, there's no bear here. And they said, stop knocking the stick in the water.
He's scaring away the fish.
Right. But, George, this boy is probably 1.5 miles into the Comanche Peak wilderness at this point. There's no adult around, and these guys let this kid just walk away. Yeah, sit down. You're not going anywhere. Just wait here for your parents or whatever. But he walks away. He was never seen alive again. And there was a huge search. They brought in a helicopter from the armed forces. That crashed. And one of the things I write about in my book is that there's 6 air-related crashes to the searches I've described in my books.
Astronomically high.
Very high. And so that aerial association I thought was really strange. But anyhow, the Larimer County Sheriff's Office did the search for Jared, even though it was in federal jurisdiction. He was on a place called the Big South Trail. And Alan and his brother and his family, they were there every day. And search and rescue wasn't finding anything.
David Paulides with us. David, these park rangers, they do say that something strange is happening. What did they tell you?
I think that some of especially the sheriffs on some of these rural counties, they know something unusual is going on, and they can't explain it. And some of them are reluctant to talk about it. Others are willing to say, how this kid got this far, we don't know. How he got this high, we don't know. We just had a call from a sheriff on a case where a little boy's missing from their area in the middle of nowhere. And he said, we heard about your work, and I want to get your opinion. And one of the things we told him is expand the perimeter of the search, because if you look at the numbers, if you believe that you've captured that area in the primary grid within a certain radius of where the majority are found, we have many, many instances where these kids are found far outside the grid areas in unexplained areas that nobody can understand how they got to it. And in this instance, the sheriff was really open to it.
Huh. Do most of them have a common denominator reason for what is going on?
I think at the point where they throw up their hands and they say, well, we don't have any canines finding a scent. We don't have any tracks leaving the area. They disappeared under the eyes of their parents, and they can't explain how they quickly got away from there. I think that the way the mind of a law enforcement person works, they're looking for an answer where there really is no evidence of what happened.
I'm not going to ask you for the reasons because you won't tell me anyway. But is there a reason you don't tell us?
Well, I think, first of all, George, you got to remember that if somebody is good at A, doesn't mean he's good at B. And I might be good at
researching
and identifying profile points and gathering the minutia of the data. But if you look at the list of things that people have come at me with over the years, I don't know how anybody could be an expert at all these things. I mean, the list is enormous. You hear about it every day in your job.
Are you baffled, or do you have really your own thoughts on what you think happened?
No, I'm baffled.
You're baffled.
Let's be serious about this. That I have thousands of friends on Facebook, and I'm pretty approachable on Facebook. I try to answer everybody that comes at me, and this is the truth. I don't know anybody that's read all 5 books and knows what happened, truthfully.
Wow. You see, I keep going back from, these are my scenarios, David, and then I want to get into some more of this. The paranormal always comes in. So, UFOs, aliens are taking people. Bigfoot running around out there grabbing people. There's a serial killer out there all over the place doing this to the possibility. There's that portal we talked about where they stumble into it. Some of them, I'm sure, wander off and they get lost and they die. That's probably a smaller percent, but that's that possibility too. So it's all encompassing. There's just whatever it is, it's very weird.
And what I tell people too, on top of that, whatever it is 100% effective, because you don't hear about people coming back and saying, "Wow, this almost took me," or "I almost fell into this," or "I saw this weird light and it almost got me." You never hear these stories.
How about sex? Male, female? Who gets taken the most?
So in the water-related student age deaths, it's 99.9% male. In the rural disappearances, it's probably 65, 70% male.
Is that unusual?
Oh,
in a planet that's about 50-50, maybe more skewing toward women?
I would say that, if you went out there on the trails or you went out there as an outdoorsman, you're going to see more men than women. Hunters, fishermen, things like that.
Right. They generally, more guys will be out camping, you're saying.
Yeah, and in those instances where there are a family setting, I'm hoping that family setting is close. They keep an eye on each other. I don't think that there are as many women walking into the woods as single hunters or single fishermen as there would be men.
That city situation aside, where they're, primarily men too, in that situation, why primarily these parks? What's so unusual about the park system or what a park is where these people disappear? Because is it easier for them to disappear?
See, I would say definitely not, because the park with the most disappearances fitting our profile, and this is by a long shot, is Yosemite National Park. It's not even close. I mean, there's so many people who have disappeared in that place that once you read about it, it will stun you. And in fact, there's probably 15 of them in the last 30, 40 years that have disappeared right in the valley of the park on a trail that is used by hundreds of people every day. Just a couple of years ago, a man named George Penca, P-E-N-C-A, disappeared on one of the biggest trails in Yosemite going up to the falls. He was last in line with a church group. Nobody could believe he disappeared. Nobody could understand where he went. But yet this is a commonality with Yosemite, that you don't have to be in the far back country to disappear. You could disappear right in the middle of humanity in the park. It's a very, very strange scenario.
Just poof.
Exactly. And then they follow that search up with cadaver dogs weeks later, and they don't hit on any smell in the area. So it kind of tells you that the person isn't there.
When they're discovered dead, are they missing anything? Body parts? Anything?
most of the time not. And the vast, vast majority of the time, the cause of death is going to be hypothermia. And in the times when the family questions that, and there's a second autopsy, in almost every incident, that ruling is overturned. And it's either an unknown cause of death, or sometimes the secondary autopsy will say, if it's near water, it's a drowning. But that's very rare.
In an era of smartphones where everybody's got them, I find this unusual as well, too. Does anybody ever report getting a call from this lost individual saying anything?
Well, that's a very interesting scenario you bring up. And in my last book, there's probably 7 or 8 incidents that I write about where the person is on the phone at the time they're disappearing. And a couple of times they'll say things like, "Oh my gosh, where are you? Help." And then the person on the other end says that they hear as though the person is moving away from the phone, and then they're not found.
Like they're pulled away from it?
It's described as though the person is moving away from the receiver on the phone.
Like he dropped the phone or put it down and something is pulling him away.
And other times there's people that say that, there's one incident, Brandon Swanson in Minnesota. He was supposedly on his way home. His car got stuck in a road. He told it was along a road he took hundreds of times going to school. He told his parents exactly where he was. They went there. The car wasn't there. He was on the phone with them, and he says, "Oh my gosh." Phone stops. He has never been found.
Huh.
And the car was found in an area where he wasn't. It's nowhere near where he was supposed to be, and his parents can't believe he was that far lost.
Have you followed this story of the Dyatlov Pass in Russia, where campers were found killed?
Yes.
Bizarre.
Oh, very.
I wonder if that has anything to do with some of the work you've been doing.
So I tell people to be very careful with this story because there's been a couple of books written about it. One of the authors and myself have communicated about this many times. There's also a documentary that's on TV about this. And in the documentary, they show a picture of a big beast. The author of the book said, "Dave, that is a complete lie. The documentary is mixing truth with fiction."
For TV, right?
For TV.
Not good.
And he says, "I went to Russia. I investigated this. I saw every piece of evidence you can find, and nothing like that was in any of the evidence." Now, he said, there is a lot of strangeness that went on with this case. What would cause people to run out of a tent in the middle of nowhere?
Or claw themselves out of the tent.
Yeah. So, he said there's a lot of strange things, but he goes, you got to be really careful. There was a lot of untruths in that documentary.
So I think it probably might have been at the time a Soviet military came across these campers who should not have been where they were, and I think the military did something to them. That's my practical thought.
Yeah, that's practical, George.
Very practical in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
But the other part of me says, no, there's something else going on, too. So let's get back to some of the missing. Paul Fugate. He's a park ranger, for crying out loud. Yes,
and Paul is the only national park ranger to ever disappear and not be found. And he was in a national monument in Arizona, Chiricahua National Monument, disappeared January 13th, 1980, a 20-year ranger for the Park Service. He was kind of a rebel park ranger, but a great park ranger. He had long hair and a mustache. And the National Park Service terminated him in 1971 for his long hair and beard. He got the ACLU involved, won his job back. And at the time he disappeared, the superintendent for the monument was gone, and so he was the temporary superintendent. At 2 p.m., he told the staff that he was going to go on a routine hike up into the park and be back soon. This is the only case, supposedly, in the files of the national park where the ranger vanished and he was never found, and there's no evidence of where he was. Now, people that know me know that I have uncovered many things about the Park Service, and this is one of the strangest ones. They have one of their employees that leaves and disappears on duty. There's a huge investigation. Arizona sheriffs are involved. The Arizona Department of Public Safety is involved. FBI is involved. I got a file that's about 1.5 feet thick on this. It's huge. Now, he disappears, and the Park Service just decides that they're not going to give his wife any benefits, and his paycheck stops. Everything stops.
Because they can't prove he's dead?
They couldn't. They thought he voluntarily disappeared.
Just ran for the hills. Jeez.
Wife sued, won in court, won all of his benefits back, and to this day, he's still gone. Now, here's something about this case that has always bothered me. This is their file on their ranger who disappeared on duty. This happened in January of 1980. I asked for a case file on a 14-year-old girl who disappeared in Yosemite National Park in 1981 named Stacy Aris. And I knew about this case because she lived in the next city over from me in Saratoga, California. And Stacy rode in on horses with her dad, with like 8 other people, into the back country of Yosemite. They got off their horses. Stacy walked with a 70-year-old man over to a rock. Everybody saw him sitting on the rock. She had her camera. She told the man she was going to walk down this boulder field and walk into this lake area a couple hundred yards below. Everybody saw her walk down inside this tree line surrounding the lake, and she disappeared. They found her lens cap to her camera inside this tree area near the lake. They never found her.
Jeez.
Now, I did a Freedom of Information Act request on the Park Service, and I get a call from one of their attorneys first asking me why I wanted the case. Then a couple weeks later, I get a call from a special investigator assigned to the Park Service asking me why I wanted the case. Now, this is an 81 case, and I asked the special investigator for the Park Service, has anybody looked at this case in 18 years? He said no. I asked him, is this a criminal case or a missing persons case? He says it's a missing persons case. And I said, so why is everybody hesitating on giving this case to me? He goes, you'll never get this case. I said, what? He says, you'll never get this case. I said, why? He says, I'm not going to say, but you'll never see it. I said, but I have dozens of other cases that I've specifically asked the Park Service for that I have. He said, you're lying. I said, why would I lie? I'm telling you the truth. He said, nope, you'll never see this, and you're not going to get any more information out of me. I was a special agent from the Park Service, and his last name is Y.U., assigned to Yosemite. Now, why, George, would they give me a 1.5 feet thick file on their own ranger who disappeared a year earlier and never, ever give me anything about the case involving Stacy Aris?
Makes no sense. Makes no sense why they're hiding it.
No, and it's bothered me for a long time, and I don't see. In fact, I appealed it through a congressman, and I lost at that level too, because what they're claiming is it's an open case. And I said, well, but the missing ranger's an open case.
Do the witnesses, those that are out there, report seeing one of the following? Craft or lights? Do they see that, David?
I have never, ever seen that in any case.
Nothing. Strange creatures like Bigfoot?
Never have seen that in a case.
Anything ghostly or some kind of mist or fog?
No, and in fact, George, if you read all of the cases that are in our files, you would think, wow, how boring. There's nothing in them.
Nothing unusual.
No.
The unusual stuff is after the fact, the clothes and things like that.
Right.
But in terms of how they disappear, nothing. It's not like they go into the Bermuda Triangle of parks.
Well, if there is one of those, it's Yosemite, that's for sure. Yosemite, Sequoia, and Kings Canyon in that area have a lot of strange disappearances.
Lots of things, David, that we just don't understand, that science just doesn't understand. Can we assume for a moment that this planet may have these portals that somehow are connected to another dimension, another multiverse, and for some strange reason, these people are going in there? And then when they come back, if they die, maybe it's exposure, I don't know what. Is that possible?
Well, the way I explain this is that you have to understand that this is something that's very calculated, because it's while a person is open to be victimized. This doesn't happen ever in front of a group. There's never a witness to it. It happens at a point where the person gets ahead of the group, behind the group, or is alone. And if there was, let's just say, I have no idea because I know nothing about this, but if there was a portal that opened up, why don't these portals ever open up in front of a group of 5 people?
It's always one person.
Always one.
What if the portals are opened up on purpose?
That's why I'm saying it's calculated, whatever it is.
And then, I mean, in the case of women and alien abductions, they talk about they've been implanted with babies. They take the fetus. Strange things like that happen. You don't get any of that, do you?
You know, George, I've been a MUFON investigator for 14 years. I am very open to these things. I keep my mind and my ears open to all of these things. I never hear this from these people.
There's no marks on the bodies, no chokes, no gunshots, no stab wounds, nothing like that.
Nothing.
If somebody were choked with the mere hands, wouldn't something show up on the throat? Marks or something?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, if you get choked and you get killed, your hyoid bone inside your neck will break, and that's an obvious cause of strangulation.
So we're not getting any of that?
No.
Now, of some of these cases, and how many have you looked at now?
We've documented about 1,600.
1,600. What percent would you say died naturally? They wandered off, they got lost, and they just died because of the elements?
I would say that the claim was the majority did, but again, when you go to the secondary autopsies, they show something else. So that makes me think that either the medical examiners don't want to release the truth, or they're not being proficient in their analysis, or they're passing on the autopsy altogether and just making a public statement about it.
Right. Maybe they're lazy. They just don't want to go through with it.
You know, I hate to say that, but I will tell you that there are 2 medical examiners I talk to all the time, and they know something strange is going on. They've admitted it to me. One of them contacted me proactively and talked about it.
Now, when they say something strange is going on, what do they mean?
Something abnormal that they don't understand.
Aha. Beyond their control?
Yes.
We're honing in on something very bizarre, aren't we?
I think so. I think it's been going, I mean, we've documented this back to 1752, so it's been going on for hundreds of years.
Nobody spent more times out in the forests and the woods than Native Americans back in the old days. Any myths or stories about disappearances in that culture?
You know, I have a couple really good friends that are Native Americans. One's a Cheyenne Arapaho Native American chief, and he told me, he said, you know, Dave, I can remember back when I was a young boy, and my mom would tell me, you never leave the light of the fire when we're in the woods camping. You stay close to the fire always. And he said, you know what? I didn't quite know what she meant, and she never made any innuendos or threats, but he said, after reading your books, he goes, that's probably wise advice Mom gave me.
Yeah, I would think so. So what about a serial killer? What percent of the 1,600? There might be several serial killers. I mean, the FBI says there could be 20 to 50 serial killers roaming this country right now, killing anywhere from 2 to who knows how many people. So what about that possibility? Some sicko is hiding in his van in a campground, and he sees somebody go by, and he goes and gets them.
So I try to keep a pretty open mind about this stuff, and I think that it's possible there may be 1 or 2 out of all the hundreds of cases, but I seriously doubt, in fact, I'm positive, that this can be anything that's happening on the trail. Because if it was happening, I mean, I live in Colorado, and I know that a lot of us carry guns on the trail. Somebody tried to do something to us, there's going to be a shootout.
You got that right.
You know, nobody's going to take me anywhere. I'm going to end my life right there on that
You're going to
trail.
go down in a blaze of glory, aren't you?
That's right. I mean, and I know a lot of women carry guns on the trails out here too, and you just don't hear about this kind of stuff happening on the trail.
Are you scared of camping and hiking since you've been doing this work?
I could say that the way I handle myself and the way I go out has changed a lot. I used to go into the woods all the time by myself. I used to carry a gun all the time just because I was a police officer, but I would always carry a gun with me and I'd go out. But I can tell you that I never go out now without a personal transponder and my gun. And within the last year, I've gotten a specific type of satellite phone because it also has a transponder on it. But I can tell you that it's a very rare day I go anywhere out there alone anymore.
These disappearances, David, how often are they happening?
More than the public realizes. I mean, just this last summer, I can count probably 10 or 12. There was almost one a week happening somewhere in North America.
Jeez. I mean, people can't just get lost that much. That doesn't happen, does it? Wandering off.
You know what I tell people is that when I'm alone, I think I'm twice as safe as when I'm with somebody else. I don't go near cliffs. I know the exact route I'm going. I don't take any chances.
Right.
And I don't think I'm unique that way. I think most people are that way.
I mean, accidents happened. The girl a few weeks ago taking photographs of people. She's backing up. She goes over the cliff. I mean, that happens. That's a horrible accident. But it's not a disappearance because everybody knows what happened. They saw that. And, you know, it's not that she fell off the cliff and nobody was around and God, who knows where she is. These are bizarre cases. These are people who simply vanish in thin air.
You know, let me just detract this just for a second. But there was a case I wrote about in 2013, I think, that hits what you're going at right on the head. And there was a retired nurse named Geraldine Largay who wanted forever to hike the Appalachian Trail, and she was nearing the end of her hike up in Maine. And her and her husband had been married for 40 years. They met every other day. She would call him and say, hey, I'm ready to meet. He would resupply her. Sometimes they'd spend the night. He was like her supply chain. It was like a match made in heaven. She was a super smart woman. And George, her nickname was the Inchworm. She moved slowly.
Yeah, methodically.
Exactly. Super smart lady. Well, she's hiking along this Appalachian Trail. She had just seen her husband the night before. She called him. She said, hey, we'll meet tonight. She was 1,150 miles into her trip, and she disappeared. And the Maine Warden Service took over the search in 2013. And in fact, for the people who watch the show on TV about Maine Warden Service, they had a special about this disappearance, and the guys were absolutely stumped. The day she disappeared, the clouds opened up, and it rained heavy for 3 days. Now, as her husband would say, my wife knew that trail. She wouldn't get off the trail. She knew where she was going. She knew exactly where we were going to meet. She knew the pace she had to keep. She was an altogether super smart, experienced hiker. She disappears. And they covered an area of that trail, and they kept moving the perimeter out and out and out. Now, they covered a 4.2 square mile area near Lone Mountain and Mount Abram, and they called it, they thought they covered it completely. The head of the Warden Service called her disappearance mystifying. Now, her body was found almost 2 years later outside of an area of Reddington Township, 28 miles from the primary search zone that they had. But they said that they had covered this area too, as well. Now, her body was found by a contractor doing survey work. This is the part, George, you're not going to believe. Doing survey work on property owned by the U.S. Navy. Now, why would the Navy own property in the middle of Maine wilderness? It was a survival, evasion, resistance, and escape school. There were huge signs completely around the property saying, stay out. And the majority of the property was fenced, and it was heavily guarded. When her body was found by a surveyor, he said he couldn't believe what he found, and he called NCIS, and they responded. Then they called the Warden Service because they thought it was some type of criminal element or possibly somebody else missing. She was found on prohibited land. The official for the Maine Warden Service said, I don't know how she got there. I don't know why she was there, and it's completely mystifying why she was found in that location because she wouldn't have left that trail. Now, it's 2 years after she disappeared. She's essentially bones at this point, and the main medical examiner said she died from a lack of food, water, and exposure, which is a complete lie. She had a backpack, she had food, she had supplies. How are you going to tell if somebody died from lack of food and water when they're all bones?
Well, and she ended up 20-plus miles away from where she disappeared.
Yes.
Which is bizarre.
Bizarre.
Does anybody ever report that these individuals, that they hear them screaming or yelling or help me or anything like that?
So there were people that they surmised were within 2 miles or less of Geraldine when she disappeared. And they interviewed everybody, and they went into the trail logs, and I can tell you the Warden Service did a good job on this, trying to track things down. Nothing. Now, she was found 2 miles off the trail into the middle of the woods on this Navy property. Explain, if she had a cell phone, she had clothing, she had a sleeping bag, coat, and food, how did this woman end up in that location?
20-plus miles away. Strange.
Makes no sense.
Strange. What about the case of Janet Castrojohn?
So, going back to Arizona now, on that case, in the same national monument where Paul Fugate disappeared, Janet Castrojohn this year in June was with her parents. She was 44 years old. She had a mental disability. She was in an accident when she was 18 years old, had a traumatic brain injury. She is partially blind and disabled. She went with her mom to leave a letter off at the campground pay station. Her family was in a motorhome. And after her and her mom went to this pay station, they stopped at the restroom, and Janet waited outside for her mom. Janet wasn't a small person. She was 5'3", 250 pounds. Her mom came out within minutes, and Janet wasn't there.
Gone.
Gone, completely gone. Her mom didn't hear anything, see anything.
Not a scuffle. You'd hear something. A body being dragged away, anything. You'd hear that.
Nothing. They brought in canines, and the sheriff's office for that area said there is nothing they can guarantee she's not there. And that was in June of this year. She hasn't been found. That was in an area called Rustler Park in the Chiricahua Mountains, within miles of the monument where Fugate disappeared. Now, you go fast forward 3 months to September 13th of this year, George, the same area in the same park. Lawrence Cosden, 69 years old, came into the park on the 13th, bought a 2-day permit, had his cat with him. People said they saw him on the trail with the cat, just walking along, having fun. He told friends he was going to be back in Tucson on the 17th. His car was found on the 15th with an expired permit. They started to search. Bad weather moved in. They searched for a couple days. They found nothing. He was never found. They found no evidence of where he could be. That's 2 people missing in the same park in 3 months. Neither were ever found.
I'm beginning to think, David, that there's something very evil going on. There's some almost demonic. I don't know why I feel that way, but it's just there's something that I just can't put together yet.
Well, I want you to put it together and tell us, because I'm interested.
I mean, is that possible? I mean, could there be a force out there that is so evil that it thrives on killing? And I don't mean a human form, something supernatural.
You know, you and I kind of move in the same circles and know a lot of the same people, and every once in a while when we're at an event, somebody will come up and talk to me, and they'll say something. And I heard something the other day from someone I won't name, but it's someone who's brilliant. And they said, you know, Dave, I've read your books, and, you know, maybe it's something so strange that we can't even grasp what it might be. But it's obviously got an intellect that we don't understand. And he said, you know, you got to keep an open mind on these things, because the conventional ways we think sometimes just doesn't work. And it's one of those things you hear every once in a while. And I walked around the rest of the day going, wow, you know, maybe that's true. I have no idea.
It is so baffling. These smiley face killers, or whatever it is. Is that still happening?
So the deaths of the young people in the rivers, absolutely. And I think that's something that, just like the park issues, it's something we're going to have to keep our eyes on, because it's something that people in the world have no idea is happening. It's a guarantee that it is going on. It's a guarantee that we don't understand it. And it's continuous. And October 3rd of this year, a man named Joe Brune, 23 years old, left a bar in Otsego, Minnesota. Friend said he had a lot to drink. He was walking towards a field of corn behind the bar and the Holiday Inn where he disappeared, near Michael and Monticello. And his friend said he didn't come back to the room and he wasn't seen. And the day he disappeared, I looked at a map and I said, you know what?
Here we go.
Here we go. You know why? Because within a half a mile of where he disappeared was the Mississippi River. And there's a lot of people that have disappeared, have been found in that river. Well, they searched the area. They found nothing. Where Joe disappeared, there's a cluster that we've identified of missing people in that exact same area. Just as a side note, Joe Brune, nationality German.
Huh.
Well, make a long story short, he was missing for 5 days, and he's found in the Mississippi River. They still haven't released the cause of death.
Jeez. No happy face on the shore or anything like that?
No.
You know, if we could, I don't know, do you think satellite imaging has picked up anything about where they were? If we had, like the girl who was outside of the restroom waiting for her mother, if she had a pinpointed time, I wonder if they could go to the satellites and see what happened.
That would be an outstanding investigative tool, and you would hope that the sheriff's office would have done that.
I wonder if the National Security Agency would release that kind of information.
It'd be a great question, but doubtful, I would say.
I wonder what you would see. And you know what's frightening to me, David, is picturing these individuals. Regardless of what hell they went through, something horrible happened to them. Can you imagine what they went through going through that moment? Oh, that's chilling.
You know, George, the thing, I try not to think about that, but being a parent, I do think about the hell that the parents have gone through with all of these people who they don't have any closure with, and they're gone.
Yeah.
And I personally can't think of anything worse being a parent not knowing what happened to my child.
Psychics, remote viewers, have they been called in on any of these?
Interesting. There is one of the most world-famous remote viewers you can imagine. And I put him onto a specific case, and I am so disappointed that this guy, he didn't get a hold of me for 3 weeks. I called him. He apologized. And make a long story short, I called him 6 different times, weeks apart. And it's either he wasn't interested or he's so scattered in his thoughts that it wasn't even worth pursuing because he never gave me anything.
That's disappointing.
We're back with Dave Paulides talking about the case of Todd Geib, and this case really gets creepy. Dave, please continue.
So, catch up is a massive search. Todd isn't being found. Canines aren't finding a scent. Helicopters aren't seeing anything from the skies. All the swamps were searched. All the lakes in the area were searched. Nothing's found. His residence is on west side of a place called Half Moon Lake, kind of on the right, on the correct side as the party. Party was on the west side of the road as well. And as the searchers are going, there's one small body of water on the west side as well, and it's called Ovid Hall Lake. It's about 1,000 feet long, and it's narrow. It had been looked at many, many times. It's not easily acceptable. Some locals fish it. You can't drive to it, and you have to walk to it, and it's a tough walk. It's in the exact opposite direction of where Todd needed to go from the party to his house. Well, people did fish the lake from May 17th to May 18th afterwards, and they were using a fish finder, and they combed the lake from top to bottom, left to right. There was nothing in the lake of a human body size. The people were interviewed multiple times. On July 2nd at 5 p.m., a husband and wife were walking down to the lake, and they saw what they described as something really odd protruding from the water. This is July 2nd. There's no ice. You know, it's a warm Michigan day. They walk down, and it's Todd's body. And the witnesses said in the reports that he was floating like a bobber. Todd's hat, his cell phone, and one shoe were missing. He was totally gone for 21 days. His location absolutely shocked everyone because it was on that opposite direction that he should have been going. The on-scene coroner classified in his report the case as suspicious, which is never done unless there's a crime involved. The coroner couldn't find any rigor mortis in the body. There was no ice in the lake. He couldn't determine if any lividity was present at all. And again, that's you always find lividity in bodies, except in these cases. Decomposition was classified as intermediate to moderate. He had the hair still on his head, and there was swelling around his eyelids. They couldn't determine the color of his iris. That's the colored portion of your eye. Now, when Gannon and Gilbertson looked at this case, they described his body as being pristine for being in the water 21 days. His blood alcohol level came back at 0.12%, just a little over the legal limit for driving. A toxicology showed that he had what's called contanine. It's a byproduct of smoking. But highly unusual is they found something called despermine. It's a depression medication. Todd wasn't on depression medication. He wasn't taking any drugs. He was a very level-headed guy. They also found something called amitriptyline in his system. And again, he didn't take drugs. They couldn't believe that they found this stuff. They couldn't determine the cause of death. It was listed as undetermined how he died, even though drowning was a possibility. They didn't find any water in his lungs. It's another case where the parents reach out to Dr. Cyril Wecht. He reviewed the case. He said that Todd had to have been dead or unconscious when he entered the water. The photos of the body were taken to a medical examiner's conference, and it was the unanimous opinion of all the medical examiners that looked at the pictures is that the body wasn't in the water for 20-plus days. The opinion was that Todd was out of the water 15 to 18 days, placed in the water. And the family tried to get the Michigan police to change the cause of death from possible drowning to murder. They wouldn't look at it. They wouldn't have anything to do with it. Now, everyone needs to understand something. Police departments, cities, counties, they work off of statistics. And most police chiefs want to keep that homicide statistic down because it's bad for business. And to change something from a drowning, which nobody really cares about, to murder everybody cares about. Now, not only is it just murder, but there's also got to be kidnapping or abduction along with this. You can't ignore that. And again, I'm going to present you with facts, not opinions, about what's going on. The fact is, Todd wasn't in that water for that entire period of time.
There are quotes that you have in the book from the guy's family, obviously pretty upset about the determination that the officials say it's not a homicide. How can it not be a homicide? You say he's a big guy. He died on land. Somebody had to drag him, carry him, toss him into that water.
Well, and the other part of this that people can't forget is the positioning of the body that's being found in these cases, completely outside the bounds of what's normal. What's causing the bodies to end up in this position? Nobody knows. But something unusual, highly unusual, is happening. And yes, the parents say things, but George, in every one of these cases, the parents are saying, there's no way this is my son. There's no way this happened. He knew this area like his backyard. He's not going to be walking in the other direction. But it's irrelevant. He didn't go the other direction. It's proven through a scientific forensics. Todd Geib and these other people that we've talked about were not in the water the entire time.
What do you make of the drugs, then? These substances he didn't take. He didn't have a prescription for this stuff. No one had ever known him to take it. It wasn't him at all. And yet, high levels of that stuff's in his system. How does that happen? How does that fit into the picture?
So this fits into the picture pretty well, actually. And It wasn't until relatively recently that I started to get a handle on this. And it goes back to this plausible deniability. Now, in my previous books, I write about these victims being found in areas that were previously searched. It goes back to the claw machine I talked about in the arcade. They're dropped into an area, they're placed into an area somehow where they guaranteed weren't in the area before. When they're found, if they're found alive, they're found in this semi-conscious or unconscious state, which apparently is these certain kinds of drugs that are in their system they're being placed in their system for some reason, maybe to make them more workable, maybe to make them pliable so they won't fight. I don't know. But these drugs are along those depression-related type drugs. And we're going to talk about more of those drugs, one specifically later. But it's all the parents say, there's no way my son would have ever taken this stuff. And I know there's a lot of people out there saying, well, kids take stuff that parents don't really know. I agree. But there's one drug that's going to come up time and time and time again that's never tested in toxicology screening and shows up time after time after time. Why? Because certain coroners are getting smart, certain cops are getting smart, and they're taking a second look at this and they're saying, okay, right away, let's screen for this.
We'll come back to that. You look at the whole book, and over again, these tiny little things that come up. I'm tired. I want to go home. I am not feeling well. I want to go home. Like something comes over people, almost as if drugs or something is put into their system without their permission or knowledge. It makes them not feel well, and then they go home, and then that's when stuff happens. It's like something is slipped into their system or their mental condition changes again and again. You look at one of those cases, it doesn't pop out at you, but when you see a pattern looking at it as you do from 30,000 feet, it becomes pretty striking.
Exactly, and I think the mind of most would go right to that, well, there's a criminal element, you slipped something in the drink. But you got to remember something. The canines, there's no tracks leaving the area. The canines, there's no scent leaving the area. So even if somebody would have picked Todd up and carried him out of the area, chances are trackers, etc., would have tracked him out of the area. They would have found his scent someplace else. But then again, he wasn't in the water the entire time. So that means he was held. Nobody, I don't care who you are, in 125 cases leaves no evidence behind. And really, there's no evidence behind of who's doing this or what's happening.
Whoever's doing it is pretty good at it.
I would say perfect.
Let's talk about Shane Montgomery. This is in Philadelphia, 2014.
Now, in my previous books, I've written time and time again about the FBI. And the FBI are the best in the world at documentation. I don't care what you say; these guys are these guys and ladies are the best. And they could go and they could sit and they monitor a case. They don't get involved, but they just sit and watch and they listen and they write. And these reports go back to their profiling unit for review and classification. And they're the best at profiling. They're the best at accumulating data. And in my past books, I've said that the FBI continually are on scene at some of these crimes, and they're writing, and they are not idiots. They know what I know, and I'm sure for a fact they know 10,000 times more. But they seem to show up. The Shane Montgomery case, to me, is a turning point for the FBI involvement, because from the time Shane went missing, the FBI was on the scene. And just not the FBI agents themselves, the FBI abduction task force agents were there, yet there was no evidence of a crime. November 27, 2014 is when Shane, 21 years old, Philadelphia, PA, he was a graduate of a Roman Catholic high school. I'll stop there again. You're going to continually hear me say that the majority of these people that disappeared have some strong religious affiliations. Shane did. Graduated from a Roman Catholic high school and was attending Westchester University in Philly. On November 26th, he was at his cousin's house, and both decided they were going to go to a bar and have some drinks. At about 1:15 a.m., Shane sent a text to his cousin saying he was in the bar but couldn't locate his cousin. At 1:28, he called another friend and said, "Do you know where my cousin's at?" Got no answer, couldn't find him. At 1:45, he bumped into something in the restaurant, and he was told that it's near 2 a.m., you guys got to leave. People said there was no way he was staggering drunk. He left the bar and was never seen again. He didn't show up for a family event on November 27th, late in the day, and the family reported him as a missing person. From the first day Philadelphia police started working this event, the FBI was there interviewing staff at the bar at Cadell's Pub. This is the first time I've ever seen the FBI there interviewing staff on an incident where there was no evidence of a crime, and Philadelphia police said there was no evidence of a crime. They were just investigating. Well, the FBI doesn't investigate missing people. Small children, there's one classification for that, but they won't investigate straight missing people. Now, they did locate a closed-circuit television footage of Shane crossing between a pub and a parking lot over a small footbridge of a canal. The footbridge passed over what was called Manayunk Canal, which paralleled the Schuylkill River. Shortly after he disappeared, the parents convinced Garden State Underwater Recovery Team to come in and start searching the water for their son, because there was really no other place for him to go in their mind. And the first break came on December 21st. Now, that was almost 3 weeks after he disappeared. This team is so good, they found Shane's keys in the river. Not in the canal they saw him walking over, but in the river. And that to me is just unbelievable they found the keys. And the search was initially focused on that canal, but when they cleared it, they moved to the river. Now, what's fascinating about this is that one of the detectives on the case was interviewed by a news team, and he was standing next to the river they were talking about Shane, and he said, well, if Shane's in the river, he's miles downstream at this point because the river's flowing so fast. And they said, oh, okay, and they interviewed him about some other stuff. Well, the same underwater recovery team that found his keys in 10 feet of water continued to look, and they looked behind a variety of locations in the area he was in. Well, days later, almost a month after he disappeared, they found his body in an exact location right behind where he was seen in an area that had been searched many times behind a brewery. And this was in the exact location where he was seen on CCTV. Now, how did he end up in the river behind the brewery in a location that had been searched many times when the detective said there's no way he'd be anywhere near there, it'd be washed all downstream? That was funny. That didn't make any sense. And the family said that the coroner told them that the cause of death was accident, but they never stated exactly what caused the death. The body was assisted and reported and investigated by not only the FBI but local Philadelphia authorities. And as of last week, the coroner and the medical examiner have never released the report on the cause of death nor the blood alcohol level.
Are you encouraged by this interest by the FBI? I mean, I guess you want the best detectives in the world, the best bloodhounds on the case looking at this. But then you have to wonder, well, maybe they know a lot more than you do, and probably do know a lot more than you do. But would they ever release it, as, other government agencies have been reluctant to do?
Well, I've filed Freedom of Information Acts against the FBI before in cases, and you get a redacted document that one word out of every 20 is readable and everything else is blacked out, so you never really get anything. So in one sense, I think, well, yeah, they're there. But what's interesting about this is back when I was a cop, there was a girl who disappeared in Petaluma, California, named Paulides. And the FBI Child Abduction Task Force agents, same guys working this case with Shane Montgomery, were pulled, and they all flew in the next day, and they worked this case with Paulides. One of the abduction task force agents knew one of our guys and said, yeah, pick yourself and one other guy and come up here. And I was the other guy. And these abduction task force guys, they are the best of the best. I often tell people, the average FBI agent probably doesn't put his handcuffs on a person once a year. These child task force agents, they are all ex-cops. They are really on top of things. If I ever had a family member disappeared, these are the guys I want looking into it because they are great. And, yeah, it in a way it makes me feel better. But in another way, I know that whatever they find, we'll never know because they'll never say. They won't even tell the other police officers working cases next to him what they know sometimes.
I can't remember if the FBI ever showed up in any of those National Park Service, National Forest missing persons cases, disappearances. Is there any hint that they are involved in any of those?
Oh, yeah. In fact, in Missing 411 Eastern U.S., I wrote about an entire series of disappearances that occurred in the Great Smoky Mountains. And there was one specific FBI agent that was assigned to follow these strange disappearances of people in the woods. And I forgot how many times, but it was a lot of times. It was the same agent, the same name, time after time. And all he would say is, we're monitoring the case, we're monitoring the case. Well, when I interviewed one of the victims' dads, Dennis Martin, small boy, disappeared, was never found. I was really fortunate to have an interview with his dad. And I asked him, I said, well, what is there about this case that I don't know? Because I think I probably know everything in print. And he says, you know that FBI agent that worked all the cases here? I go, yeah, his last name was Reich. He says, exactly. He goes, do you ever know what happened to Agent Reich? I said, no. He says, he committed suicide.
Oh.
And I later confirmed that Reich did commit suicide. I don't know why, and that's all I know.
Well, that would be an interesting file to file a FOIA on, is his file. You know, the FBI does not handle missing persons cases, but of course they handle kidnapping. So maybe some determination has been made that a few of these that they popped up in are kidnappings. It'd be interesting to figure out how they knew and how they categorized it that way.
Absolutely. And, you know, you and I and everybody that has 1 ounce of common sense, when you look at the physical facts, there's obviously some kind of kidnapping abduction that's occurring. But in many of these cases, they won't say that they're there investigating that.
You mentioned he made 4 phone calls from what he described as some kind of a field. Were those to all different people?
So this is an important point, because first one was to a friend, and then the other calls weren't made public who they made them to, but there's an entire series of these that I write about in the book where right before the person disappears, and I mean right before, they're on the phone or they're calling somebody, and then at that point they're separated from the conversation somehow. And sometimes the people get out a sentence. Sometimes they'll say something like, "Oh my God, where are you?" It's like your last words you ever hear from the person, and then they're not found.
One of those, I don't remember which case it was, but you said the guy had dialed 911 and the call lasted 1 second, and then poof, it's dead.
And sometimes if you drop a phone on the ground, it will automatically dial 911 sometimes. Other times, maybe it was them actually looking for help. I don't know.
In the Todd Geib thing, you mentioned something I didn't remember from the book, but I thought that the witnesses said it was the sound of either heavy breathing or wind. What made me think of is Todd flying through the air.
George, you're not the first guy to think that. There were probably 25 of these books that went out as review copies, and I got probably 5 or 6 of those type of responses. And it's hard not to go there right away. I try not to, but I think there could be something to that.
Let's go to Stephen Kubaki. I've been saving this one, and I hope I didn't oversell it too much, but this just really blew my mind. And take it away.
So Stephen, 23 years old at the time, February 19th, 78, another February disappearance, this time in Holland, Michigan. And it's interesting that we're talking about Todd Geib. Holland is just north of Casnovia, also in an area where there's been these clusters of strange disappearances. And also, Stephen, again, was strong religious ties. He was going to Hope College, which is part of the Reformed Church of America. This location that he was at is 30 miles north of South Haven, 76 miles south of Ludington and Baldwin, the cluster area I was telling you about. In February of 78, Stephen was attending Hope, and this is the part that's going to sound strange again. He was trying to get a degree in German. On February 19th, Todd told his roommates he was going to go cross-country skiing along Lake Michigan near Saugatuck, and when he didn't return, they filed a missing persons report. The Michigan State Police led the search, and they pulled out every stop imaginable. The Coast Guard on Lake Michigan went out, tracking dogs, helicopters, foot patrols, and the state police found his skis and his poles on the beach of Lake Michigan, and they saw footprints on the ice leading out 200 yards out onto the lake. And they flew over it, and the footprints just appeared to stop. And they thought at the time that because it had been a couple days that maybe he had just fallen through the ice, died, and because there were no tracks coming back. And another report stated that they found his backpack in the same general area. So he was essentially separated from everything he had and apparently walked out on the ice. And the determination that after a couple weeks searches, police wrote down that they believed he died and drowned on the lake. Now, fast forward to May 5th, 79. This all occurred February 1978. So, you're looking at about 15 months later. Stephen says he woke up in a field on a Saturday night, 40 miles from his father's house in Deerfield, Massachusetts. John Kubaki was his dad. 53-year-old father told in interviews, he goes, I thought my son was dead. And he said that he walked up to the door and said that he doesn't remember a lot. He woke up in Pittsfield, said he was lying in a meadow, and he was wearing clothes that weren't his. Now, this is 700 miles east of Lake Michigan, almost in a straight line. Now, in 1983, Stephen went back out and got an MA in linguistics from Ohio University, and in 92, he went back to the University of New Mexico and got a PhD in clinical psychology. I tracked him down into Washington. I called, tried to make a contact with him, told the receptionist I wanted to talk to him, sent him a personal email that I wanted to talk to him. He would never respond. Now, what's important about this, he's a missing student. He's missing in an area that is quoted as the Great Lakes Triangle, and I talk about this in my book. That is a great book that talks about a series of disappearances in and around the water of people, planes, and boats that are as unusual as the disappearances I talk about in my book. Stephen's missing time and space, and reporters asked him if he'd ever see a psychiatrist, and he said no, because I don't have any problems.
So he had to have been interviewed by police, his family. Hey, where you been? What did he say?
I wish I knew, because in all of the articles I pulled on this, it never said that the police took an interest in it, never said that, because if you think about it, there was no crime that occurred. Remember, anybody can disappear, and it's not a crime. Now, there was some pretty strong evidence that there was factual evidence. He walked out on the ice right directly from where his skis and things were. So where was he for 15 months? He says he wakes up in a field wearing somebody else's clothes. He said that there was other things in a small satchel that was next to him that were maps and things that weren't his, and he doesn't know where it came from.
The thing about clothes, in his case and in other cases, it pops up all the time, that you got different items of clothing. I remember, I know you don't want to be necessarily associated with alien abduction cases, but there are quite a few of those cases where people are wearing their clothes, but they're on backwards or inside out from when they went to bed. There's a missing time, a missing memory kind of a thing, and they've got their clothes are totally wrong. This guy woke up with somebody else's clothes, seemingly in a trance. I suppose, we'll talk about the importance of that.
Well, again, going back to what you just said, I write about cases in past books where young children were found and their sweatshirt was on backwards, or they were missing clothes, and the parents stated that they couldn't undress themselves, and they had no idea how this thing got on backwards, or in another case, how the child ever got their clothes off. So, and, I think I've talked to you about this before, the work of John Mack. I've read his books, and he was a psychiatrist from Harvard who was studying the abduction phenomena, and he wrote extensively about some of the things we're talking about right here. And it's not that I want to ignore it at all, because I do see that there is some correlation in the facts between what I've written about and what Mack presented.
Well, you don't want to box yourself into a corner, and, you don't want people necessarily assume that you're talking about alien abductions, but these are abductions. I don't know exactly who's doing them, but they are abductions. There's no question about that. I know that word carries a particular context on this program and these kinds of circles, and maybe you're not comfortable with that, but these are abductions, no doubt about it.
Oh, no, and I think I'd be a fool not to admit that now. I mean, there's been some of the most competent police officers and detectives around that have said, hey, these are abductions. People don't want to admit it. They don't want to sit there and address the facts. But I'd go toe-to-toe with anybody to say, hey, show me that they're not.
Stephen, this guy we're talking about, he's gone for 14 months. I mean, couldn't he I guess he wandered off, had a girlfriend he didn't want to tell the family about. He ended up living with her, and then he pretends he has amnesia when he comes back. Suppose?
Again, anything is possible, but I think that the reality of the facts that presented themselves would say, no, that wouldn't be true. And unless Stephen was a very well-read guy back in 79 and knew about the clothing, the wrong clothing, the ill-fitting clothing, how would he know that this fits into other scenarios that I've written about? How would he know that this area of Michigan has had a whole series of disappearances that are equally strange to his? I mean, the parallels to other things are just phenomenal.
He's a clinical psychologist these days, you say, with a practice in Seattle, Washington. I just wonder if we have some listeners in Seattle who might know him, who might have some insight into his story. Maybe what we need is somebody to get an appointment with him as a patient or something and then bring up the subject. I mean, ideally, what you'd like, and you mentioned it in the book, what you'd ideally like is for him to undergo hypnotic regression and see if he could remember where the heck he was all the time.
And again, this wouldn't be to embarrass him. It would be, he would help out hundreds of other people that have, and families that have gone through similar scenarios to what he did. He's one of the few that ever came back.
Well, maybe he's got your letter, Dave, and he's thinking about it. We sure hope so.
I do. I hope so.
So there's a lot of, most of these cases, all of the cases we've talked about so far are young men, but there is one on the list that jumps out at it. You described it as one of the most mysterious cases you have ever investigated, Elisa Lam in Los Angeles.
Now, before I tell the audience about this case, what were your feelings about this case, George?
Well, it was weird. I mean, the stuff about the hotel jump out at me, which we haven't really touched on that, about particular locations where the things happen more than once. In the early going of this book, you mentioned a couple in Chicago where you got two cases from the same hotel, which just, of all the hotels in Chicago, just seems kind of strange.
And
but go ahead.
And Towers. In this case, Elisa Lam, 21-year-old student from the University of British Columbia. Unusual right there because there's a couple of cases out of UBC I write about in the book. January 31st, 2013, she travels from Vancouver down to Los Angeles. First of all, I'll talk about the location before I talk about her. This all happened at the Cecil Hotel, 640 South Main Street in L.A. It opened its doors in either 1924 or 1927, differing opinions there. 14 floors. There's 4 water tanks on a platform on the roof. There's restricted access to the roof. It's alarmed. They advertise the location as for business people. It's in an area that's now considered kind of a skid row. The residents of this place are interesting.
Yeah, that's to say the least.
Night Stalker Richard Ramirez lived there. He's convicted of 13 killings from 84 and 85. He lived on the 14th floor for $14 a night. Some called the Satanic Killings. In 91, Austrian Jack Untweger came to the U.S. and lived at the Cecil. He supposedly promoted himself as a journalist covering crime in L.A. He lived in the hotel for 5 weeks, killed 3 prostitutes in his room. In 64, a woman named Goldie Osgood was staying in the hotel. She was stabbed, raped, and died in the hotel. In the 50s to the 60s, the Cecil got notoriety as a location for the most suicides of any hotel anywhere. And there was in 54, a woman named Helen Gurney jumped, killed herself. In 62, Julie Moore jumped out the 8th floor, killed herself. October 62, Pauline Otten jumped out and landed on a pedestrian, killed both. At this point in the book, I said, now, would you like to know the history of a hotel before you booked a room in it?
Yeah, I mean, it made me think of The Shining. So, yeah, I'd like to know.
Yeah, and then I think now, after I read about this, I thought, how many rooms have I stayed in where there's been a crime that's occurred in it, and I never even knew. So Lisa was a psychology student at UBC on holiday break. Her family owned a Chinese restaurant in Burnaby. She rode Amtrak to L.A., got a room at the Cecil, And according to her Facebook post, she went to the San Diego Zoo, went to a Conan O'Brien show. Friends stated that she never, ever would drink alcohol or smoke or take drugs. She called her parents daily until January 31st, 2013. Parents knew right away something was wrong when she didn't call. They called Vancouver PD, who called LAPD. LAPD brought out search dogs and scoured the hotel from the bottom floor to the top floor. And the dogs were taken to the roof, and they found no scent of her anywhere. Nothing was suspicious. On February 14th, LAPD released a CCTV video of Elisa on the elevator. And you can Google this right now and see it. It's an unbelievable footage of Elisa wearing black shorts, red sweatshirt, sandals. She enters the elevator, presses the buttons, and she kind of backs herself into a corner, and she looks frightened. Some people say she's talking. She peeks outside the elevator, goes in and out, presses the buttons, trying to get the elevator to work. It doesn't. She goes in and out a few times, finally gives up, walks outside, gets out of view, and the elevator door closes. Never seen again. On February 19th, a resident in the hotel complained of low water pressure. The maintenance man took a ladder to the roof, unlocked the access door to the roof, turned off the alarm to the roof, and made his way to 4,000-gallon tanks that sit on this platform about 5 feet up off the roof. And these 4 tanks sit on a platform. Each tank's about 4 foot in diameter, 8 feet tall, with slick sides to them. He puts the ladder up next to one of the tanks, opens the latch on the top of the tank, looks inside, and sees Elisa floating face up and naked. He gets down, calls LAPD robbery homicide detectives, and they respond out. They're baffled by what they see, but they figure out that the tank opening is too small to remove her body. They cut a larger hole into the top of the tank, and they see her clothes and sandals around her in the tank. The coroner responds, removes the body, no visible injuries. On February 20th, 2013, CBC is the major news organization in Canada, and they schedule an interview with robbery homicide detectives. At the 11th hour, right before it's ready to go, LA cancels and never gives another interview about this. Nobody would talk about it. On February 22nd, a coroner's report came out and stated the cause of death was inconclusive. And for 4 months, there's nothing. On June 20th, the coroner stated the cause of death was accidental drowning, accidental death. They didn't test for certain substances in the body. They found her blood alcohol content at 0.02. But when the body decomposes itself, blood alcohol will show up, and that was the reason for that. I said, okay, I'm going to try to find out more about this. So I filed and got a 27-page coroner's report on this case. Now, she was wearing the same clothing that she was wearing in the elevator. The coroner's report said it wasn't suicide and no foul play was incurred. Think about these words as I read them. No foul play, no suicide. They said death was accidental. You got to follow the logic here. So you must believe that Elisa went to the roof, got in the tank somehow without a ladder. She wasn't under the influence of drugs. No drugs were found. Does this make any sense to you at this point?
I'm trying to remember, how did she get into the tank anyway? You said that the opening was so small. I mean, how did they propose she even got in?
They don't propose anything. There were no ladders on the roof, and you had to have a ladder to get up the slick side. How she got in, that's $1 million question.
I remember the footage because a lot of TV stations around the country played it, including ours. It just was so weird. It was like something out of a horror movie or something. Just weird.
Now, it gets weirder. Now, as I'm doing the follow-up on this case and I'm checking for articles around that date, I find an article about tuberculosis in L.A. So Elisa was pulled from the water cistern on February 19, 2013. On February 21st, there's an article in the L.A. Times, and it says CDC, the Center for Disease Control, is dispatching scientists to Los Angeles to understand a horrible and bad strain of tuberculosis spreading so rapidly in the LA area that they're trying to understand how it occurred.